I don't know if she's going to be online or.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Why don't we call this meeting to order? I will note it's
This meeting is being recorded.
6:28. So early to start, early to finish. That's the hope. All right, let's start with introductions of board members and staff. I know we have a lot of staff here today.
Peter Burrows, Superintendent.
Victoria Jetty.
Suzanne Bowe.
Joanna Doria.
Bruce McIntyre, Director of Facilities.
Jamie McCallum.
Barb Wilson.
Brian Bauer. Peter Conlon.
Mary Gill.
Nagi Sanzali, Student Representative.
Steve Orzak.
Chip Malcolm.
Jen Newseeder. Mary Heather Noble.
Will Hatch, Technology Director.
Kim Quinn, MYP Coordinator.
Joy Dowson, PYP Coordinator.
Cindy Atkins, DP Coordinator.
Courtney Cron, NYP Co-Coordinator.
Caitlin Steele, Assistant Superintendent of Teaching and Learning.
Justin Campbell, High School Principal.
Logan Price, Business Manager.
Nicole Carter, Director, Equity and Student Services.
Great. Thank you all for being here. I sense a presentation in our future. All right, at this time, we'll open the floor to public comment, both on...
Oh, do we want to introduce?
Oh, Lindsay. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Will you introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My bandwidth is not, I don't know, it's not very clear.
Okay.
Lindsay Hescock.
Terrific. Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, so at this time, we will open the floor to public comment. Just a reminder, public comments are encouraged and welcomed at each of our regular board meetings. Comments are limited to 3 minutes per person, and citizens will be called on by the board, or the chair, that's me. And public comments regarding personnel, students, or legal matters will not be heard by the board. If there's anyone on Zoom, please raise your Zoom hand. Otherwise, if there's anyone in person who'd like to, please state your name, and I will give you a
3 minutes on the board.
a finger
I
up.
don't think I'll take 3 minutes.
Okay,
so.
okay.
My name's Laura Harthan. Some of you may recognize me because I've sat in on several meetings over the past couple months. At many of these meetings, school board members have spoken about wanting to engage with the public in a meaningful way, and I've been thanked for coming and encouraged to attend by several board members. With this apparent desire for community engagement, I was both surprised and dismayed when at the last school board meeting a parent was not allowed to ask a question during what had been described as an open question and answer session. Given the recent restrictions on how long a member of the public can speak during an open public comment section, and that the board is not allowed to, and that the public is not allowed to ask questions during meetings because it's a meeting of the board, I figured that there must be a board policy on public engagement. I was surprised to find that the ACSD school board does not have an official policy, but that the Vermont School Board Association does have a recommended policy that the ACSD board has not adopted. I'd like to encourage the school board to consider adopting the VSBA recommended policy A21, public participation at the board meetings. In particular, I'd like to point out the public comment on agenda items, which is on the second page, which I will get to. Public comment on agenda items. 1, the chair will ask for comments on agenda items before action is taken by the board. And 2, when the number of people wishing to speak is large, the board may authorize the chair to use a speaker's list. Members of the public will be given an opportunity to sign the speaker's list indicating which agenda item will be addressed. I think it's important to have meaningful engagement with the public. And when the only point that the public has to come and talk before the school board is 3 minutes right at the very beginning of the meeting, when something may come up in the agenda that somebody in the audience who is not a board member may have some sort of insight to or comment on, I think allowing an opportunity to have that sort of engagement while limiting to a degree that it doesn't disrupt or make too long board meetings would be a good idea. And I would like to encourage the board to at least consider adopting that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kurt.
My name is Kurt.
My name is Kurt Broderson. I'm going to cover some of the same ground here, I think, so I'll be concise. I'm concerned about recent movements by the ACSD board to restrict public comment, notably the guidelines now added at the bottom of each agenda that public comments regarding personnel, students, or legal matters will not be heard by the board. The timing of adding these limits to ACSD's agendas suggests that this was a result of hearing public comment during the April 11th board meeting, during which a teacher spoke of how she was treated by administration during the reapplication for her position. I believe that this attempt to limit public comment is due to a misunderstanding of the difference between public comment and executive session. If the board wishes to discuss personnel, student issues, or legal matters, they must enter executive session. Public comment, however, is not a discussion and is not part of board deliberation, and by Vermont statute is open to any matters over which the board has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. I will note here that ACSD does not have a public comment policy, A21, listed in its policies and procedures as is recommended by the Vermont School Boards Association. I have some copies of those I'll leave with you. Lacking such a policy, Vermont statute states that the board chair has discretion to establish reasonable rules for public comment so that meetings proceed in an orderly and timely fashion. Both the Vermont School Boards Association and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns provide advice to boards, giving examples of rules for managing time, ensuring decorum, and maintaining order. Almost all of their advice focuses on maintaining efficient and orderly meetings by setting overall and individual time limits based on the number of speakers who wish to make public comment. Critically, these restrictions must be viewpoint and content neutral and must be applied to everyone. The recommended policy from the Vermont School Boards Association advises to restrict only comments which breach the privacy or other rights of students, parents, or school employees. Limiting public comment removes an important means of communication between the public and the board. It is a disservice to our community when we can only comment on things the board wants to hear. And I have a handful of the recommended policy from the Vermont School Boards Association, which I will just leave for later viewing. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Davina Damar. I'm here tonight to follow up on a letter that was sent out to the school board regarding a racial slur that was used against my daughter. This is not an event, but of a greater import that it is an indication, a real symptom of a deeper and systematic problem. The fact that it is my daughter is secondary, but certainly powerfully reinforces the need for more inclusive public and school awareness. I'm hoping for a plan of engagement that is open to the scholastic community and the greater community that provides learning opportunities and broadens cultural understanding. Basing these slurs, racial and otherwise, on ignorance and fear, our approach has to include enlightenment, history, and sharing. We appreciate the school's response. This is not something we intend to let slide by on the radar, nor should it. It has been a clear and present issue and is no way a new one. We should hold ourselves accountable for and to provide opportunities and examples for change. Thank you for listening.
Are there any public comments on Zoom? I'm not seeing any hands. So may I have a recommendation to approve the minutes of May 9th? Thank you. Second? Thank you. Any questions, comments, or other? No? Wow, Mary Heather. Well done. So all those in favor of approving the minutes of May 9th, can say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Joanna?
Lindsay abstains because I was not at the last meeting.
Great. And Joanna Doria abstained. Thank you. Chip, approve the bills.
3 warrants were read on the 16th of May. First one from the general account of $219,723.03. The second one was a payroll warrant for $273,289.83. And the third one was also a payroll warrant for $4,108.59. No problems with those.
Great.
I read those, so I move we pay those bills.
Second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Barb? Any questions or comments? All right, all those in favor of approving the bills? please say
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Great, the bills are passed, or approved. So, the professional appointments, everybody, I assume, saw that in board pack. Once again, this is just an approval of those additional contracts. Steve?
When we asked Mr. Dudek last week, he said that there were 13 people leaving the middle school. Does that include the 6 that are on this list? Because that's a
Yeah, it would.
significant
Yeah.
number.
It would, yeah.
Okay.
All right, can I have a motion to approve the professional appointments?
So moved.
A second? Thank you. All those in favor of approving the professional appointments as seen in our board attachment? Actually, I guess there's a motion on the table. Are there any additional questions or comments? No. Okay.
I guess I have a comment.
Yeah.
I'm just alarmed by the numbers of people who are moving and leaving. And I know we talked about retention and we offered that, but we're still not doing a good job retaining our faculty. I think we need to put some effort into this for next year so this doesn't happen again. We're losing a lot of really good people. And I'm alarmed by it. So I think we need to be listening to what would be helpful to do more retaining. It's been rough all over. I'm not saying it's just our district. I know it's everywhere. So just I think it's something we need to really put some energy into next year.
And I agree with Mary. I'm going to ask the question I always ask. So are there contracts that are still pending? I'm just worried about what more may be coming our way.
That's in my report.
Oh, it is? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I jumped ahead.
I can go now, but either way.
Let's get, since there's a motion on the table,
Yeah.
let's get the motion finished.
Before we do, I have one question.
Yep.
And this is for Peter. Are there exit interviews being conducted with the folks that are resigning their positions?
Yep.
And will that be included in a future superintendent report?
It will, kind of a summary of it, sure, yeah.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of approving?
I have a comment.
Oh, sorry, Lindsay, comment?
Oh, that's okay. I know it's so hard with one person on here, so I don't mean to be rude.
No, not at all. No, interject when you need to.
Thank you. I was going to ask the same question Mary Heather posed. Will there be exit interviews? And if so, will the board be able to have some information, about that? And then I'm curious what we have in the pipe to fill these positions. And then a final question is, do we have, I guess it's similar to what Mary was saying, when someone gives their notice when they resign, is there ever a dialogue about, well, what would we need to do to keep you here?
What, can we do this motion, and then when Peter gets to his report, I think part of his report is going to include answering those questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So, all those in favor of approving the professional appointments, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you.
It is one truth.
Peter,
Thank
it's
you.
all you.
Okay, great. So the last couple weeks I started my learning visits, which I had done prior to COVID and haven't done in a number of years. So just wanted to share that has been really, really good to make connections with people that I've maybe seen in the hallway once or twice over the last years, but really haven't had a chance to connect with. Prior to the pandemic, on my school visits, I'd go in and talk with the principal and then spend a fair bit of time out in classrooms, just kind of connecting with people. And as you all know, the conversations you have in the hallways and the parking lots are sometimes more meaningful than sitting down in a meeting and doing something formally. This past year, my visits to school buildings have been primarily working on crisis management with principals. So we've spent a lot more time figuring out things related to staffing and all the other kinds of challenges that we faced this year. So it felt really good to do that and connect again with folks that I have long relationships with that I just have not talked to in a long time. And to hear about kind of what's happening for them, not that I don't really know what's going on in schools, but sitting down and kind of hearing what people are really kind of holding that they want to share with me in this role, I think is really impactful as we look ahead. At some kind of initial takeaways are, I think we've talked about this a lot, but there's such a high level of fatigue right now in terms of what our staff are carrying. It's not just teachers, it's all of our staff are carrying as we kind of plug the holes. One of the realities of this year, I think this year more than any other year we've ever had, is every day now when the sub-callers have to start the day, they are scrambling to try to fill all the positions, and I see some heads nodding of people that have been in schools and know what this is like. People have had to do many, many different jobs this year just to fill positions, just to have classrooms run and have the learning system function. So that in and of itself has been pretty challenging. The loss of control that I think our staff have felt over the last number of years is significant, and that kind of like having to like approach every day not knowing kind of like how it's all going to work has been a big challenge. So that's something that as we look to next year, I'm hoping that we can be in a slightly better position so we don't feel like we're in this reactive space all the time. Also, a lot of folks just shared kind of the needs of the classroom right now are really different, and a number of teachers shared about how challenging it was in terms of some of the behavioral challenges and other things that they see in the classroom, and trying to manage both the social emotional needs of students, which pretty much everyone has shared, those are increasing, and they are also holding on to the academic goals and priorities and feeling really committed to getting all of that work done. So that creates this like inherent tension when you're both trying to put that aside and say, social emotional learning has to come first. Like students have to be present and well in order to learn, and then just kind of trying to go back to the academic. And I heard that a lot from a lot of people, so that's something that I'm just kind of ruminating on and thinking about as we go into the summer and think about next year. And I've got a number of visits left, so this is just kind of like the first part of that. I'll share more at our next board meeting. In terms of staffing, right now, just as an update, we have 13 open para positions. So some of these positions are being filled right now. We're right in the middle, we're at the tail end kind of the real kind of like big wave of hiring. So these aren't positions that we can't fill, they're just that these are processes that are in play. 13 para positions. As I mentioned previously, I have the most concern about filling our para positions because they've been the hardest to fill throughout this year. We've had open positions from the beginning of this year that we've been unable to fill. We have 3 elementary positions. We have 7 MOMS positions that are currently open and we're in the process of hiring. We have 5 MUHS teaching positions that are in process right now or nearing completion. 2 SLPs, speech language pathologist. That's a position that's always hard to fill. I don't know when the last time we were fully staffed. Nicole, when was the last time?
My understanding is 5 years ago.
Okay. So that's a problem of economics and salary and what SLPs make outside of the school system is one of the big factors there. And 3 special educators. So that's kind of where we are right now. You know, I think as we think about like some of the challenges we faced this year with staffing and going into next year, that, as I said, those 13 para positions are probably the ones that are kind of illuminated the most in thinking about, because a lot of those positions are support positions for students, they have a reverberating impact in the school if you are missing 3 or 4 of those paras who are either working with intensive needs students or filling other roles. There's a cascading impact to not having those positions. So that's something that we have to figure out and problem solve. We have a group of leaders. Justin is on that group with a number of other ACSD principals who are kind of talking through right now, how do we go about if we run into a situation where we are short and we have needs across the system, how do we respond? And I think I've mentioned this previously. It's something that we've confronted already over the last 2.5 years, and there's a potential in looking at next year and hearing from you know, my colleagues everywhere else. Everybody is talking about this right now. I have been in conversation with the Addison Independent. They're going to do an Addison County-wide article. I think it's maybe coming out next week on staffing challenges, and so we shared all of our data with them to let them know where we are, and they got that from Mount Abe and Addison Northwest too. I talked to Patrick and Sheila, and their kind of percentages of number of folks that are leaving, their retention question are kind of more or less around where ours are. And I'm, you know, was at a superintendent's conference last week and talked to folks, and this is a really, really big issue, and you know, I've shared this before in terms of where we are with the demands of the work, and that it just public education as a whole is in a somewhat tenuous position, I think, in some ways. So it's important that we kind of like rally around. I was reading a national NEA report the other day on teacher retention and percentages, and the number that stuck in my head, 59% of teachers are now going to leave the profession earlier than they would have in this national survey that they did. So that's, I mean, that's significant. So there is work happening at the state level. There's work that we can do at the local level, but it's going to take, I think, everyone to kind of look at what schools are carrying, to think a little bit more about the social emotional wellness and the health aspect of what schools do. And schools, if we expect schools to do all of these things, we maybe have to think differently at the state level about how we fund schools and what kind of supports are in schools. We can't expect all of it just to magically happen without the funding. So that's my update.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's a bit of a gray cloud, but I'm just being honest.
Yep, appreciate that. People have questions, comments for Peter? Steve?
I see that we have in the executive session personnel. Is this going to be part of that discussion?
Nope.
Well, it's easy.
Okay, then I have to, most people preface this by saying, I hate to say I told you so. I'm not that kind of person. I'm the kind of person that's gonna say, I told you in October what would happen if we didn't fix what was going on at the middle school. And this does seem like a crisis. All these people that are leaving are not, some of these people have been here for a very long time. We're not intending to retire. We're not intending to leave. And now they're leaving. And having spent time at the middle school, I hate to call particular people out, but we got to start doing that. There is a problem at the middle school. And I would like to know what the administration is doing to address that. Personnel-wise.
I mean, I think we're doing a lot of things, have done a lot of things, and are continuing to do a lot of things to make it feel, you know, in terms of like the culture and the reality that's made it so hard this year, and that's got to be with every employee and everyone in MOMS coming together and really kind of like building forward. I think in terms of how do we, like what specific things we're doing, we've moved, as you know, from 3 teams to 4 teams. We have changed the leadership model, so we have a co-principalship now instead of the current model. We've kept a 3rd administrator on for 1 more year just with the transition. We are continuing to look at ways to support a stronger transition. So the work happening right now for 5th graders going into 6th grade, we're looking at that and being at a much more granular level than we did last year. We have stable leadership going into next year as opposed to last year where we had someone new coming in, which was a challenge. You know, and really I would say the last 2.5 years with, or 3 years probably, with changes in leadership at MOMS. So I think we're better positioned going into next year to have learned from how this year went and respond to it. And it was a hard year, and you know, I think I said this previously that I understand it, and you know, some folks are leaving teaching. Some, you know, a number of the departures are not going to other schools. They're just leaving teaching or leaving the area. So it's, I mean, everyone's got a different reason for why they're moving and going to you know, a new job opportunity. But yeah, I mean, I think we have to continue to look at what's working, look at what's not working, and be together on it. And I think we know with the kind of support we have in our community and with the quality of our educators and our staff that we can do it.
This list alone is all of the math department and 2/3 of the social studies department. Is there anything even remotely similar at the high school or Mary Hogan, which are the only similar sized schools that we have?
I would say the high school doesn't have nearly as much by number. Shoreham's actually seeing more turnover than MOMS.
Okay.
By numbers.
Mary Heather, did you have a question?
It's escaped me now, but
You'll
come back.
Thanks for your report. It was glum a little bit at times.
I know.
And
I usually bring lots of positivity, but
no, I mean,
this topic is tough.
yeah. And I've heard, I mean, from folks at MOMS as well, stuff that I think Steve was talking about. I mean, I hate to be obvious, but like, you alluded to like funding changes and stuff like that. Like, can we pay people more money? Like you said, it's harder almost to fill para positions like we're competing with McDonald's sometimes to hire parents.
Yeah.
And maybe we're losing, and sometimes, and being a parent is a harder job in a lot of ways. So it's like, what can we do that? Can we raise wages?
So we can through the bargaining process, so most of those positions are contracted. Some are not, or some are covered under a non-union contract, some are covered under a union contract. We can,
So some of the paras are non-union, outside the contract.
Paras are part of the union.
They're part of the union,
contract,
okay, yeah.
But
okay.
some support staff positions are not part
Okay,
of a union contract.
okay.
Like SLPs,
Like
are they part
SLPs.
or not part?
They are
They're
part of the
teacher.
contract,
They
yeah.
are.
Yeah.
So who's not? I'm just curious.
Some of our behavioral team,
Okay,
are not,
okay,
um,
okay.
as an example.
I mean,
So,
like, I
so that's
guess,
something that we are talking about,
Right.
and we're not to that place right now, but as
have
we
we,
get closer.
like, in the last year, 2 years, as opposed to just a COLA raise, have we done more than that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but our agreements are generally 3 years long.
3 years long, right.
I mean, we've had a couple 1 years here recently, but the last one was 3 years, and it was for 4.4, 4.1,
Okay.
3.7,
I think, for support staff.
And when we unified, I mean, maybe you can speak to a lot of the unification process about this topic was sort of bringing everybody to the same, using the same ladder. So there might have been a para in one school that was not making the same as the other. So there was, after unification, there was sort of this evening of the playing field, so to speak.
Right. I mean, one of the kind of labor impacts to public schools is, in the private sector, with inflation, you can just go from, today we're going to offer you this, tomorrow we're going to offer you that. Whereas with public schools, you have it's this really long range, so it takes longer to catch up because you have these long negotiated agreements.
Yeah.
Question. What percentage of the people who left the exit statements indicated that they were leaving because they were not receiving enough money?
Which exit statements?
You said when a person leaves, there's maybe an exit
Oh,
interview.
Yeah, those have not happened yet. Those are
Okay.
those are coming. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think, honestly, I mean, this is just before talking to people, but I don't know as money is the driving factor for people.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, I don't think it is.
In leaving, but maybe in luring.
Yeah, I mean, certainly people shop different districts, which is why we've tried to stay competitive. People will look and say, on this salary schedule in that district, I can make $6,000 more. That happens all the time.
Mary Heather.
Yeah, I have two questions, Peter. One, if you could just remind me, because I'm interested in the context of some of this, some of these troubles, and sort of beyond COVID. Can you remind me if the fiscal year that we are in this year, when we were budgeting for that,
Yeah.
was that a year where we were at the state spending threshold or had that threshold already been suspended? Can you just remind me where we were in that world when we were budgeting for that we're now living?
Yeah, so in this current fiscal year 22, we were over and we used fund balance to cover. It was when we started building the budget, the threshold was in place and then it was taken away. So it didn't, after the fact, we didn't have to put that money towards the budget, but at the time we did.
Okay. So in terms of planning for staffing levels, things like that, that was the world we were operating in. And at what point did that circumstance change where we may have had more flexibility in terms of staffing? And obviously, I think we all are aware that ESSER money helped to
It all
pay
kind of
for
was a
these.
confluence at the same time.
Okay.
So the ESSER funding came in at the same time that the state suspended
Threshold went away.
the threshold. I mean, it was kind of like all of a sudden, you know, the whole system had changed, right? Like, especially when you think about last year and the last fiscal year and the kind of like highly regimented reality that we were in schools.
Right. So I guess I bring it up because I think it's important for people to understand the budgeting circumstances, you know, in terms of planning and now what we're living and the money that's become available to, you know, support some staff to address those things. I think it's just important for people to understand the full picture. And then I guess the other question I have for you, Peter, is you had talked about working with the leadership team to, you know, talk about potentially creative ways to address para shortages in the district. I'm just wondering can you give us a sense of some of the ideas that you've kicked around so far? What?
I'm actually not on that committee. Justin, do you have anything to share about what you kicked around?
Hi, everyone. I think the main thing we were kicking around is sort of the triage situation. So if we end up in a situation where we're not fully staffed with paras across the district, how would we as leaders address that situation in a way that's fair to and equitable to the schools and the students and also the employees themselves, right? So transferring between schools is something that's happened a bit recently. And so I think that was more the work that our committee was doing, as opposed to how do we attract additional paraprofessionals, was sort of that balancing out the what if scenario that, as Peter said, is looking somewhat likely that we won't potentially be fully staffed in that area and might be thinking about how we prioritize across schools and districts.
Are there any paras who are at the table in these kind of discussions about ideas on how to problem solve around this, or is this just the leadership team?
Yep, we pulled in some paras as well. Yeah, it began as a conversation at the leadership, so the leadership, the full leadership group was meeting and this issue arose, and then a group of us have kind of gone off and taken the lead on it, but we've involved paras as well. Obviously want to make sure their voices are heard and they know the daily job and sort of how the job in one building might be different or might impact their personal life if their commute was X miles and now it's 2X.
Right.
You know, so we've definitely been talking with them, and the advantage of sort of a group of leaders is that we can each, you know, I'm at the high school and the job of a para there is different, substantially different than the middle school versus the elementary schools, and so we've been able to sort of pull those voices in from different levels and buildings as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and actually the para thing prompted another question, so I have a couple. First, when I look at the appointment list, I don't see paras on there. Have we been able to fill some of the vacancies at least?
We still have like those 13, so we're still working on it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a little worrisome, you know, because, you know, the great news is, you know, music and math, you know, we are seeing some of the staff being replaced, but the paras, I don't see much happening. And I'm a little nervous that if we, by need, have to shift paras around, that could actually prompt more to go, you know, because they get used to being in a particular school, working with particular kiddos, and then just makes me nervous that actually may cause more of a problem. The other question I had was, you know, with the massive turnover, especially at MEMS, how does this impact our IB status? Because now we have all these trained professionals, that has spent the last several years really building up the knowledge that they have. And now we got people coming in aren't
Yeah.
most likely gonna have IB knowledge. So how do we deal with that? Or how do you
I knew
deal
we were
with
gonna
it?
ask that question, which is why the 4 coordinators are in the back. And
Okay.
they're gonna be presenting shortly
Okay,
and can probably speak to that in terms of what we're doing in onboarding and thinking about training.
so that seems very big, yeah. And the last thing is just more of a comment. I'm kind of heartbroken being math is my, just all the math teachers are just about all the Jan, I think, leaving
Yeah.
mums. And, you know, they were great people.
I agree.
Okay.
I just have one question about the pairs. Do they qualify through their union to get a pension like our teaching staff does?
They don't pay into teachers' retirement. And so
Do they-
they don't get that, but they do have a match on, what is it, 3%, Peter?
It's increasing, so I think the next year is 4%, and then the year after that maybe 5%.
Okay.
It's optional,
Yeah.
and few actually take advantage of it.
I just wonder if they were on a pension system, it would create more longevity because they would be building up their pension
Right.
and be less likely to say, oh, forget it, I'm just out of here, even though you have only 1 year left or 2 years left or whatever. So is that something is that a state level?
I mean, the state level pension system doesn't cover paras, so.
Right, I know, so would that be something we
it's
have
just,
to?
that's why we have the leading up to the 5% maybe next year, right?
Yeah.
It's graded up.
Mhm.
So that's why we're offering that.
Yeah.
But that's
But I could
not,
see that.
that's probably not enough for someone to like feel the kind of commitment like you're talking about with a
Right.
teacher's pension where you're gonna get 60% of your
Right.
last highest salary. That's an incentive to stay
To
once
stay
you've
on.
been in this system for a number of years, so. Yeah, we would have to look something there, but I mean, I think we might be in a place where, and again, this is gonna, I think some of these solutions will happen at the state level, because everybody is in this situation, not being able to hire these positions. We have to maybe think differently about them, so that's one idea. I'm not sure, I haven't heard anything from the state saying they want to, work on a pension system or the AOE has talked about this issue, but I haven't heard any solutions from the state yet. So I think at this point, going into next year, we're gonna be creative and think about ways to, to get the folks in and,
Do they get
we-
tuition reimbursement at all if they advance their training? Can they get tuition? Is that?
there's not a tuition benefit in the
These are some
contract.
things we
no.
could be looking at.
Yeah.
So just, the answer to your question is, I don't think in our union contract there's anything about that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of money being thrown around by the state right now.
There is.
Recognizing this problem, just in terms of getting more teachers coming out of school qualified to be teachers. It doesn't solve the para problem.
No, but
I mean, these issues are
yeah.
significant and can only be solved by human beings.
Right.
And more of them in a state where we have no housing or childcare available.
I know, that's compounded
Uh-oh.
all over.
I think I started this.
All right,
Not
let's
to glum
move
it up
on to
and
the-
put-
We need to move on, you know.
Yeah, we're gonna be here all night.
We're gonna be here all
Have
night.
to go home at some point.
We gotta move on.
I think I'd like to
Yeah.
welcome Ruth
Yes.
Hardy, Senator Hardy, who's here to present on the many Splendid realities of waiting.
Where should I sit? Should I sit?
Yeah,
there?
maybe we come up here.
Is it possible to share slides?
You can send them to Will and he can cast them here.
Oh, I'm sorry, Will. I did not send them to you. I did send them to all of you guys. Can you send them to him? Thank you. Hi. Thanks for being here. It's really nice to be here. It feels weirdly deja vu-ish. Okay, so let me just get myself a little bit organized and then. And that, what is, I sent you is just a PDF, and should I just tell you to slide it forward, or what? How do you want, Will, do, because I can't control it. But I did send it to all the board members and to you, Peter. It should be in your email. I'm sorry I didn't include you, Nargis. I'm sorry, I should have.
Okay.
But
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I will have to comment on this.
oh,
There's a quiz later.
you're gonna get it better than most of the people in the room, I'm sure. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me. For the record, I'm Ruth Hardy. I'm a state senator from the Addison District, which includes all of Addison County, plus Huntington, and next session, Rochester. And I am on the Senate Finance Committee, and I co-chaired the Pupil Weighting Task Force in the off session, which also Representative Conlin served on. So I am here to give you an overview of S-287, which I found out on the way to this meeting. A reporter called me and said that the governor has signed it. Did you know that yet, Peter? The governor signed it late this afternoon, so it is now law. Yes, I'm very excited. I just want to say at the offset, I'm going to be taking my glasses on and off all night because I'm a middle-aged person. I'm going to wear my mask because I have weekend plans for the first time in a really long time, and I do not want to get COVID. I can go into so many weeds on this topic, and it usually takes me at least an hour to go through a full presentation on the pupil weighting factors and S-287, but Peter told me I had only 45 minutes. So Victoria, please cut me off when you need me to stop talking. If anyone wants to meet for coffee and go over this more, I'm happy to do it. I clearly love this stuff. And I will try to talk fast, but interrupt me if you have questions of clarification during the presentation, and then I'm happy to stay as long as you all want me to answer your questions. So, S-287 has a very long name, an act relating to improving student equity and by adjusting the school funding formula and providing quality and funding oversight. It was just signed by the governor today. You want to go to the next slide. And it's just a PDF, so I'm not sure. You'll probably just have to scroll. Yeah. Sorry, I thought I was going to be able to connect my own computer to the fancy system. I want to start with some background on the school funding system, because unless you understand where we're coming from, you're not going to understand what the changes were. Okay. Mosquito. Oh my gosh, she's trying to hit me already.
We weren't able to kill it during the.
In our last meeting, it kept circling around our heads, so.
How weird.
It's destiny.
Okay. So, background on the school funding system. In 1997, there was a landmark school Supreme Court decision based on our school funding system called Brigham, the Brigham decision it's known as. And Brigham actually is the name of a family in Whiting, so it originated in Addison County. And basically it was a case brought against the state because towns like Whiting were not able to raise sufficient tax revenue to provide an equitable education to their students compared to towns like Stowe. So the Brigham family, among others, sued the state, and the landmark decision, Brigham v. State, was decided by the Supreme Court in 1997. And it led to Act 60. So anybody who's been around school funding formulas in Vermont knows about Act 60. In 1997, and it also was championed by Addison County legislators. So the roots of it are in Addison County. And Act 60 created a focus on taxpayer equity so that every student, no matter where they're from, has the same tax base behind them, the ability for a town to raise tax revenues to support that education, the education of that student. And Act 60 created a new tax equalization formula, which is one of the most equitable in the country. And this is even before S 287. We are one of only 2 states that has a tax equalization formula that basically tries to create equity across taxpayers, so that regardless of your income and regardless of your town's property values, you should be able to raise funds to provide an equitable education for your students. We have a state education fund. Act 60 created the state education fund, which is a shared fund into which all towns and all school districts pay. And then all schools are funded from the education fund. It has multiple revenue sources, including homestead property taxes, non-homestead property taxes from businesses, and second homes, et cetera, and solar arrays, et cetera. Some sales tax, it has all the sales tax revenue, the lottery funds, and some sales and use funds. So it's a multiple funding source. It's self-balancing in that whatever is determined at the local level is to be spent on schools, we raise through the education fund and then distribute it back out to school districts. There's strong local control of school district spending in Vermont. You guys create the budget, voters pass it, and then the legislature sets the yield, which is the amount, the rate that is the amount that needs to be collected from property taxes and other tax sources to fund schools throughout the state. So the state does not tell you how much money to spend, you do. And that's really important in our funding system. And it covers all local school budgets. Most Vermonters pay on income. They pay school taxes based on their income level, not their property tax values. I believe this year it's about 68% of Vermonters that pay on income. So when you hear about high property taxes, the vast majority of Vermonters do not pay those. They pay based on income, including probably most of us in this room, or many of us in this room. The school funding formula uses a combination of pupil weights, which I'll get into further, and categorical aids. The 2 largest categorical aids, the largest one by far is special education funding, and the second largest one is transportation funding. Categorical aid is for something that's for a category of spending, like special education or transportation. The system is complex and it's collective. So it enhances equity, but it creates confusion. And that means that any changes in the system or any changes that individual local school districts make ripple throughout the entire system. So if a school district passes a really large bond, it will impact everybody else. If a school district decides to change its governance structure, it will impact everyone else. We are a collective system in Vermont, and that's really important to understand. Okay, next slide. Oh, that is way too far. Sorry, it should have a picture of a cake. Peter, do you remember this cake? So I want to emphasize 2 things tax capacity. So a lot of what the pupil weights do, and when I explain the pupil weights a little bit more, they adjust tax capacity. They do not adjust budgets. They do not adjust the amount of resources that are available for certain types of students. They adjust tax capacity, which is the ability of a school district to decrease its tax rate without reducing its spending, or the ability of a school district to raise additional tax revenue without increasing its tax rate. So that's what the pupil weights are adjusting. So a lot of what the discussion was is that we're moving resources, we're cutting the pie differently. Well, what we were just doing was allowing different school districts to either increase their budget without increasing their taxes, or decrease their taxes without decreasing their budget. Again, I want to emphasize local control. Individual communities determine the balance between spending and tax rates. New weights would impact local decision-making, but new weights would not change the reality that different school districts have different spending priorities, cultures, and taxing tolerances. Here in ACSD, our budgets almost always pass. We have a culture of supporting our budget. That is not true in every school district, and this formula change will not change the culture of school district spending. So, next slide. So it should be 4-step school funding process. Again, just want to emphasize school boards create school district budgets, local voters approve budgets, AOE calculates each school district education spending amount based on voter-approved budgets, and AOE pays each school district its education spending amount from the education fund, plus any categorical aids. So this is how it works after you guys approve a budget and the voters approve a budget. It goes up to AOE that then sends money back down. Education spending is total district expenditures less offsetting revenues from non-education property sources, including federal aid, categorical aid, tuition, surplus, interest, donations, etc. Vermont does not have a per pupil funding system for school districts like other states. Other states say, I'm going to give you $10,000 per pupil and that's what you have to spend. Vermont does not do that. The local districts determine how much they're spending per pupil. Okay, next slide. So that's sort of the background of the funding formula, and it was super fast. I'm talking really fast, so hopefully you got it. Is there any questions of clarification? Are there any questions of clarification at this point? Okay, yes?
You said that the state does not restrict spending at the local level. What about if you go over a certain number, you get double taxed? Isn't that restricting?
What I said was the state does not determine what the local spending is.
Okay.
So we don't, the state, I'm going to say we because I'm a state legislator, we don't tell you how much to spend on school district. What you're referring to is the education spending threshold, their per pupil threshold, which I believe Superintendent Burrows mentioned has been suspended during the pandemic. We suspended that. And S287 actually suspends it for even longer until FY29. So have at it. The spending threshold, you're right, if your school district budget goes over the per pupil spending threshold, the amount over that threshold is double taxed. And that is a means to control spending or to not permit school districts to go over the spending amount without having some kind of penalty. Usually it's a really small number of school districts, and we looked at this extensively in this work. But it's a difference that the state does not tell you how much to spend. It just, on a per pupil basis, it just says there's a cap. But that's been suspended for quite a number of years. As I mentioned, the Brigham decision happened in 1997. Act 60 passed in 1997. And there were some changes along the way. Act 68 made changes in, I believe, 2002. Then we had a number of significant pieces of legislation that implemented a universal pre-K formula, that did career pathways, that made major changes to special education. Act 46 made changes to governance and the organization of school districts. So there were a lot of changes along the way. But what didn't change was the pupil weights and how we count pupils in our funding formula. The pupil weights precede Act 60, and prior to Act 60, we had what's called a foundation formula, which is what a lot of states have. And that is basically saying we're going to give you $10,000 per pupil, and then we're going to build off that foundation based on the type of pupil you have. And so we had weights that were based on a foundation formula. Then we changed to a tax equalization formula, and we never changed the weights. And it was really hard to change the weights because nobody really knew what the right weight was. And a lot of it was just sort of guessing. The weight for poverty, students living in poverty, was 0.25. But nobody knew if that was the right amount. are students who live in poverty 25% more expensive to educate than students who don't live in poverty? Nobody had the answer to that question. It was basically just the best guess. The one weight that there was an analysis done was there was a weight for high school students. It turns out high school students are more expensive to educate than elementary school students because of the specialization that's required for high school, the different labs, the different array of topics that high schoolers, and they could look at high school budgets versus elementary school budgets and really make a decision on that weight. But the other weights, they had no idea. So in Act 173, which was the law that implemented major changes in our special education program, the legislature asked for a report about, or a study on what the pupil weights should be and whether they were accurate. And that report was the Pupil Weighting Factors Report. Since 1997, there have been a lot of advances in data collection and large data set regression analysis. There's been a better understanding of educational equity. And the study, which was done by the University of Vermont, Rutgers University, and the American Institutes for Research, took data from 2010 to 2019 for all schools and all school districts throughout the state and implemented a very extensive regression analysis to compare the differential resources necessary for educating different types of students to achieve equivalent outcomes. This was based on test scores, and don't get me started because this is my biggest problem with the report is it was only based on test scores. So I'm hoping we can change that in the future. But what it found was that students of varying types and circumstances require different funding in order to educate them to the same outcome. To get the same test score, the student living in poverty, it costs more to bring the student living in poverty up to an education, the same outcome. Or a student who requires English language learning education. Or a high school student, they also added a weight for middle school students. Also very small schools or very rural schools. And they found that the current weights were outdated. So that was a major report, and that report came out in December of 2019. And the legislature started to look at it, and then in March of 2020, the pandemic hit. So we basically stopped and went home and dealt with a lot of other big things. So last year in 2021, the legislature did what it often does, which when they can't solve a problem, they create a task force to solve the problem. So can you go to the next slide, the Pupil Weighting Task Force. This was created in Act 59 of 2021. And this was an off-session legislative study group that was made up of 8 legislators, 4 senators and 4 House members. I was a co-chair along with Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro in the House. Representative Conlon, Peter Conlon, was on the task force as well. And we worked from June to December of 2021, really doing a deep dive into the Pupil Weighting Factors Report and pretty much everything about our education funding system to try to figure out what changes we should make to our education funding formula and system in order to make it more equitable. So we looked at weighting calculations and values, categorical aid possibilities, poverty measurements, mathematical functions. We spent a lot of time talking about math. Education quality standards, transition mechanisms, special education. We looked at Act 60, Act 68, Act 46, tax equity considerations, and the excess spending threshold, Steve. So we spent a lot of time, and we issued a report in December of 2021. The email I sent all of you has a link to both the Pupil Weighting Factors report done by the UVM and the task force report that came out in December of 2021. And if you want to geek out about this, I highly recommend you at least skim those reports because you'll learn a lot about the background of all of this. So, next slide. So the task force recommended 2 basic means for moving forward. One was to update the weights as recommended and then amended by the authors of the report, or to create a new formula, which we called the tax equity formula. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole of explaining what our second option was, because what the legislature decided was to implement the updated weights. So S-287 was a bill that came out of the Senate Finance Committee and then went over to the House and passed to update the school weights, the pupil weights. So a lot of bills that are substantial have findings in them, and so I just listed the major findings that sort of preface the bill as to why we did what we did. Talked about the Brigham decision, about substantial equality of educational opportunity throughout Vermont. That was the sort of promise of Brigham, which led to a statutory requirement of substantially equal access to quality basic education, differing student needs based on school resources and outcomes, the recommendations of the pupil weighting factors report, and then the pupil weighting task force recommendations. All of these are findings at the beginning of the bill. And then the goals of S-287, to increase educational equity by ensuring sufficient resources for students in varying circumstances, to improve educational outcomes, improve transparency, and enhance educational and financial accountability. So our system is really complicated, which also means it's hard for people to understand, and therefore it's often not very transparent. People don't understand why their tax rate is what it is, why school districts are spending a certain amount on students, and they, go to vote on a school budget and may not understand what that means. So we were trying to look at ways to enhance the transparency and the understandability of our school funding formula as well. And that's why we talked a lot about math. So I'm just going to cut to the chase. The next slide should be oops, I missed that one, the goals of 287, but you can skip right over that and go to the next one, the pupil weight changes. So this is a table of how the pupil weights changed. Yeah, stay there. Okay. So there are categories. Thank you, Will. There are different categories for the weights. There are student needs, so poverty, students living in poverty, and I'll get into the definition of that in a minute. The current weight is 0.25, as I mentioned. The pupil weighting factors report and analysis showed that weight should actually be 1.03. So basically, students living in poverty are twice as expensive to educate to the same standard or same outcome as students not living in poverty. English language learners. This was the most substantial change. You can see it goes from 0.2 to 2.49. It's an enormous change. And plus, there's a mini grant that's in the footnote, but I'll get into that later. And we also changed made changes in how ELL students were accounted for in other parts of the formula, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So those are the student need categories. The grade ranges. As I mentioned, that we added a middle school weight. I heard you talking about mums. It's actually more expensive to educate a middle schooler than an elementary schooler. So the research showed that there should be a middle school weight and an increase in the secondary weight too for high schoolers, grades 9 through 12. And here we're talking about math. You can see it goes up from, maybe I'll just stand here. It goes from 1.13 to 0.39, which looks like it's decreasing, but it's actually just changing the base. This is on a base of 1, and this is on a base of 0. So we talked about what happens when you change it. Are there any math teachers in here?
I saw.
Oh, awesome. You could come up and explain this. So this is not a decrease. It's actually an increase in the weight. So pre-kindergarten was not part of the study. So for universal pre-K, kids are weighted at 0.46. This was not part of the pupil weighting factors report, unfortunately. I wish it had been. I would have solved a lot of problems. But we know this weight is underweighted. Preschoolers are actually more expensive to educate because they have a higher ratio need for educators. You need more teachers in the room for preschoolers. So there is a an early childhood education financing study that's happening starting next month, and we're going to tackle that weight next year. So this is to be determined. Stay tuned for those of you, I see you nodding in the background, the pre-K weight. So enrollment, we currently have small schools grants, and they are distributed on a really complicated, convoluted formula in a really weird way that pretty much everybody hates. So we're getting rid of the small school grants and including weights for small schools. There was discussion about whether these numbers are actually small schools in Vermont context, 101 to 250 students. Those are pretty big schools for Vermont, but the researchers found that the schools in those range cost 0.07, so it's a tiny little weight more than schools that are bigger. And that schools with fewer than 100 kids are 0.21. So there are weights for small schools, and I'll talk more about that in a sec. Population density. These are the really rural schools, and you can see that there's different levels of population density. The really rural with fewer than 36 people per mile, 36 to 55 per square mile, or 55 to 100. So these don't impact most of Addison County. There are a couple of places in Addison County, but it's really the Northeast Kingdom and some of the more rural parts of the state. Yes, Brian?
Yes, I was wondering why there isn't a group of your top students and their needs.
Yeah, so there was discussion about students with gifted and talented students and whether there should be a weight for gifted and talented students. It's interesting, Vermont is one of the few states that doesn't have a gifted and talented sort of state program. So we didn't dig into it because it would have required defining what a gifted and talented student is, creating a state program for it, and it wasn't part of the UVM study.
The problem with that, I think, is equity. That those kids are not getting an equitable amount of money to serve their needs, and they should be in that chart.
There are people who made that argument for sure. It wasn't part of the UVM study, so it was sort of part of a to be continued study, but it certainly came up in our work on the Pupil Weighting Task Force. Yeah. Barb.
Hi. And I know you meant to say district. You said schools, but the population density is on a district basis.
Yes, this population density is on a district basis. The enrollment is on a school basis.
Right.
Yes. Yep. And an interesting change that the House made compared to that wasn't considered before was that it does not include water. So if there's a big lake, or if your district might include part of Lake Champlain, they subtract the square mileage that's just water. Because nobody can live there, right? Unless you're ducks. Okay, or fish. All right, so those are the weights. Any other questions or comments about the weights? And
I guess one
Yeah.
question. So with pre-kindergarten right now, that 0.46 is really kind of an exchange for $4,000 that's paid out to private providers
Right.
primarily. If that weight was given what it needs to be, which is quite high, like you mentioned, would that be a step towards actual universal pre-K?
That's a great question, and that's something that we'll be working on in the early childhood education financing study. So stay tuned.
Good.
I'm heavily involved in that, so I'm happy to chat with you
Yeah,
more
love
about
to.
it.
Love to.
It's clearly a problem and needs to be fixed, but it didn't get addressed in this study. So yeah, Jamie.
Thank you so much for this. So maybe this is, I can't tell if this is jumping ahead or not because I don't know what you're going to say, but is this just about allocating money to districts? It's not about spending money on certain populations.
It's a great question.
Is that clear?
Sort of. You're almost there. It's about the tax capacity. So it's allowing school districts with high numbers of these types of students or in these types of circumstances to be able to raise the tax revenue to educate those students without increasing their tax rate. So I sent you all a district by district sort of estimated impact, and I'll show you on a slide coming up, the impact on Addison County. But the classic district that benefits, the district that in the state that benefits the very, very most is Winooski. They have a high number of students in poverty. They have a high number of students who are English language learners, an enormous percentage of their students. And so with these added weights, so every student who's in poverty is
Right.
is weighted twice as much basically, and 2.5 times for ELL. And if you're both a student in poverty who's also an ELL student, you get much more weight in your students. So that allows Winooski to raise more tax revenue for those students without increasing their tax rate. And remember, it's a shared education fund. So what it actually means is that Winooski is going to draw more from the state education fund compared to other districts that have fewer of these students. So the opposite end of the spectrum is South Burlington or CVU.
Right. So, but it does not mandate that Winooski
Spend it. Nope, it does not mandate it. And this was a very large conversation that we had in the pupil weighting task force. Should the state say, hey, if you have these students, you have to spend this extra tax capacity on these students? There's no guarantee. And as Peter can attest, I grilled school superintendents about this issue. What are you going to do to guarantee me that you're going to spend that additional tax capacity on the students who need it?
And what do they say?
So it's really up to you guys. You're the ones that are making the local decisions on how to spend the money. It's up to the school boards and the superintendents to do right by the students. And
I'd put it on the school board.
and so this is a conundrum of our system. We have a very strong local control state where school boards and school superintendents and voters make most of the decisions, and then the state funds their decisions. We literally raise whatever is necessary to fund what the schools do. And it was really there was a lot of discussion that we should trust local schools and local school districts, and that communities know what's best for their students. And it was challenging for some of us to say, okay, we're going to let that go and we're going to trust them. But that is exactly one of the sort of, and I'm happy to chat with you more about it. Victoria?
But just to be clear, the counter to that, the fear is that a district could get the money and then potentially use it to suppress their local taxes.
Right, so they can make the decision to, and what I'm guessing most districts who are going to sort of benefit from this are going to do is they're going to do a combination. They're going to increase their budget and spend it on some things and also decrease their tax rate and sort of maybe not halvesies, but do both. And some districts, but that is up to the local school district. And one of the things that we tried to put in were increases in educational quality standards that speak to accountability. So the bill includes educational quality standards for financial oversight, for administration, for governance, and for sort of board management for the first time ever. So there are more sort of oversight quality standards. There are several reports. The Senate version of the bill had a very extensive evaluation and audit to see whether or not the changes actually resulted in the outcomes that we hope that meet the goals of the act, and that's one of the reasons I sort of outlined the goals. The House unfortunately watered that down quite a bit. I was able to slip some language into the state budget that sort of beefed it up again, but really I think a lot of it is going to be evaluation and accountability and see, does this actually increase student outcomes? In 5 years, will we see outcomes that are better for students in these categories because we've changed the pupil weights in our formula? And I think that's the crux of the conundrum and the question that I personally struggled with a lot. But based on the research that was done, I think this is sort of the best situation we could have hoped for. Yeah, Joanna?
Can you clarify if ELL is treated differently, the weight for the English language learner, if there are strings attached to that? Like you have to spend that for ELL?
Yeah, so I have a slide on ELL. I'm going to go into that a little bit more because that ended up being the toughest category. And you may have heard some of the hubbub about it around the state. So I'll go into that a little bit deeper in a second. Yeah, Brian.
What I'm wondering is whether education is attempting to fund in areas that is not its own responsibility. And
If who is? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Once again, I'm wondering whether education, the money going into education, is in fact funding certain areas that are the responsibility of other agencies and not the responsibility of education.
Yes, that's also a question that we struggled with. School districts are spending a lot more money on social services, health services, et cetera, and how to address that. There's a separate bill in that the legislature passed that deals with mental health services, school mental health services. But that was also an issue, and whether or not there should be a weight that is specific to that, or whether or not there should be a separate funding source. That's kind of an ongoing discussion about our school funding system.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other things at this, yeah, Nargis.
I just wanted to speak to that too. I'm currently doing research projects on kind of language learning, and especially in the refugee community. I know Winooski, that's a huge thing, and it really, because there's not enough funding within refugee organizations, especially within the state, a lot of that has to be taken on for school. And while it's easy to say that, well, they can just, the refugee organizations should just give more money, it's while that happens, you can't leave students who are in schools hanging, unable to learn English language skills, so especially in that category. It's,
Yes, and again, I'll talk to that in more depth when I get to the slide because it was a big issue. I'm going to just stay standing because the energy's better. So could you go to the next slide? English language learners, here we go. Okay, so this, as I said, turned out to be one of the most difficult parts of all of this. And where we ended up is not where I had hoped we would go, but the separate weight, so one of the things, the English language weight, it's the 2.49 weight. It's a huge weight and a huge increase from 0.2. And one of the things that it does is it separates the ELL weight from the poverty weight. In our current formula, there's an assumption made that all ELL students are also students living in poverty. So they are included in the poverty count without any kind of means testing. They're basically double counted in our current system. And that's one of the reasons the weight increased so substantially, is because once we took them out of the poverty count, that the fact that they were getting weighted over here and over here had to be compensated for, and it increased the weight substantially. And it actually decreased the poverty weight. So the poverty weight in the original study was like over 3. So like 3.2, I believe. And so the poverty weight dropped down to 1, and in the ELL weight went up to about 2.5. So that was one thing that was changed. It's a dramatic increase in the ELL weight. There's a lot better understanding of ELL student needs now than there was in 1997 or pre-1997. We talked to a legislator who was involved in Act 60, and he basically said, we just didn't have any information on what it took to educate ELL students in the mid to late 90s. And so we just guessed at a 0.2 weight. So there's a lot more information on what an ELL program that's robust and meaningful and provides all the services and supports that Nargis was talking about costs. And that's one of the reasons the weight increased so much. So what we did in addition to the weight is we created a mini grant for districts with fewer than 25 ELL students. The task force heard a lot of testimony about what kinds of services school districts provide for ELL students. And districts like Winooski and Burlington and other districts that have a lot of ELL students have really robust programs where they have cultural liaisons, they have They have tutors, they have translators, they have a full slate of ELL teachers, and they're able to provide much more comprehensive services for ELL students. ACSD is probably kind of in the middle, and then there are some districts that provide very little of anything for their ELL students. They literally are putting out flyers saying, hey, does anyone speak Spanish in the community and want to tutor this kid? So they're really, we found a very wide range. We also found a wide range of what school districts are spending on ELL students. Actually, the district that was spending the most per pupil was ACSD. And the districts that were spending less per pupil, the districts with a lot of students that had a sort of high economy of scale were probably saving because they had more students and they had fewer schools across which they didn't have to have their ELL students, ELL teachers driving all over the place to teach 1 or 2 kids in small schools. But then there were some districts that were spending very little, like less than a couple $1,000s per student on ELL. So we found a wide range. And we found a difference in sort of community support for ELL. Some communities were really supportive, others were more skeptical of ELL or more skeptical of immigrants or refugees or whatever. So what the task force actually recommended was a categorical aid grant that would have required school districts to spend the money on ELL students. It would have said, you're getting this money. That's what categorical aid grants do. You get special education funding. Peter has to spend it on special education. He can't say, oh, I actually want to spend it on driver's education. So that's what a categorical aid does. And I will just be honest, that's what I thought we should do. But that's not where we ended up. So this is the compromise. There's a mini grant for school districts with fewer than 25 kids who are ELL students. And that provides them with funding on top of the taxing capacity to give them enough sort of ability to hire a teacher to teach these students, to provide sufficient funding. We did add more requirements. We added a subchapter to the statutes that lays out what ELL programs should look like. It basically follows federal law, so it codifies federal law and state law, saying you need to do these things. We also created requirements for AOE to provide support for school districts for their ELL programs. A lot of school districts just really don't know what a quality ELL program is supposed to do. So we required AOE to do that. And gave AOE some money to be able to support ELL programs. We also required a report, because we do that all the time. The House particularly loves reports. In December of 22, so this is the first report that's required, and it's about ELL students, regarding differential weights. So any ELL teachers in the room will know that there are different levels of ELL based on the level of English proficiency. And these are based on federal requirements and testing of students' English ability. And so there was a question of, should there be differential weights so that students who have the highest English language learning needs would be weighted at that 2.49, and students who are almost able to fully speak English and and learn in English maybe would have a lower weight. So we asked for a report on whether or not there should be differential weights and whether or not the amount that we put into the mini grants were sufficient. So that's where we ended up with ELL. It was basically a compromise that happens in the legislature all the time. So does that answer your question, Joanna?
Yeah, just quickly a follow-up. Is the mini grant census based on less than 25, or is it just straight for any district with 25 or less?
There's 10 and under, and then 10 to 25. And basically this report will look at, did we get it right? Because to be fair, it was just a guess at that point. We knew we needed to provide extra money. And we sort of looked at how much does a teacher cost and how much could a part-time teacher cost. But we're going to get more information on whether we got the cutoff right and the amount right and the weights right. Yeah, well, I saw Jennifer and then you, Jamie.
Thanks so much. So just clarifying, like definition and how schools sort of report ELL, just like super basic, like 2-minute explanation would be awesome, or maybe even 1 minute, maybe it's just simple. And then to follow up, on the numbers of students, right? So like, say you had 25 students that all, need Spanish, or, that were native Spanish speakers, that would be different than 2 that are Japanese speakers, and you know what I mean? So like, is that weighed into it with like the different types of languages, because you can't just hire one teacher for 10 students if there are 10 different languages?
So a couple answers to that, and I'm not an expert on ELL, but I learned a lot about it. The definition of ELL students is based on federal law, and the TOEFL exam, which I can't remember what that stands for, but it's the English language.
Test of English as a foreign.
There you go. So there are federal, and they are federally required. School districts are already federally required to do the English language services for students. And they are a protected class of students also, meaning there's a higher level of scrutiny on providing an equitable education for those students. The problem is that most school districts in Vermont do not have sufficient numbers of ELL students to actually have the federal oversight. So that there are 10 districts that receive federal aid in Vermont to provide ELL services. The other 110 districts don't have federal aid and therefore don't have as much federal oversight. So that's part of the issue. They do have to report to AOE, but we upped that. And Vermont is part of a national coalition of school states that follow the WIDA curriculum and standards for ELL education. And I'm blanking on what WIDA means, but it's WIDA. It's out of University of Wisconsin. So there are sort of state standards for that. In terms of educating students with a number of different languages, this came up a lot. I mean, there are, I think, over 100 different languages in the Burlington School District, and it's really challenging. However, an ELL teacher doesn't have to be a native speaker of that language. ELL teachers don't necessarily speak the 50 languages that they might be teaching students in English to. My mother was an ELL teacher, actually, and she speaks French, but nothing else. But she had at least 15 different languages in her classroom most years. And so a lot of it is really just getting a teacher who is skilled enough to teach teach English to kids whose native language is multiple languages. Does that make sense? And if there's any expert in the room, please correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, other questions on ELL? This was a tough one, but I think we're gonna be okay. Next slide. I'm way over time, I'm sure, Victoria, so you can just give me the hook if you want. Small school and merger support grants. This is really relevant to ACSD. So as I mentioned, they're small school grants. They're confusing, they're complicated, and most school districts hated them. In the sort of study that went along, the interviews that went along with the pupil weighting factors report, they interviewed a bunch of people and nobody said they liked the small schools grant. We got rid of the small schools grant and have the small schools weights for those 2 types of small schools. The schools must be in a school district where the population density is less than 55 people per square mile. So they're really it can't be a small school in Burlington because that school doesn't necessarily have to be there because they could be, combined with a school down the street. So it's really for very rural small schools. And the weights only apply to the pupils in that small school. So if there's a small school with 99 students in it, only those 99 students get the weight, not all the kids in the district. Does that make sense? We did maintain merger support grants, and this is what's relevant to ACSD. So when schools merged under Act 46, the small schools grants that individual school districts got turned into merger support grants. And the merger support grants were also very complicated and got convoluted with the small schools grants. So we separated them out. We maintained the merger support grants, whether a school district was voluntarily merged or told by the State Board of Education that it has to merge. They will maintain their They're merger support grants, so that's true for ACSD. You're welcome, Peter. Okay, so
put in a plug for that.
any questions here, Barb?
Yeah, what's the ACSD's population density? Do you recall?
So
I think we're
ACSD,
just above.
yeah, it does not qualify for any of the small schools grants. You can't also qualify for both the small school weight and the merger support grant. It's either one or the other. So once a district moves into the small school weight, it loses the merger support grant and vice versa. So it was really something that I was really like very adamant about, the districts be able to get one or the other. So I know you emailed me. I heard you, Barb. Okay, next slide. I'm almost done, I really am. Math makes a difference. Measuring poverty, this is not something I talked about yet. The current poverty measurement for the school district funding formula is the SNAP funding, which are essentially the nutrition benefits or food, yeah, you know what I mean. No, not free and reduced lunch. Food stamps, that's the word I'm looking for. Used to be called food stamps, it's now SNAP, it's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So that is what is currently used for determining whether or not a student is in poverty. It's not a very accurate count because one, it's a program that's not actually too easy to enroll in, and you have to be eligible for enrollment or enrolled in the program in order to be counted as a student in poverty. Especially in really rural areas of the state, it's not actually very easy to do it, and a lot of families don't do it, or they're ashamed to do it, or there's stigma to do it, or there's pride, or whatever, or they just don't know that they qualify. So a lot of parents don't enroll in it, and therefore their kids are not counted as students living in poverty, and the district doesn't get the weight for that student. So what we decided to do was move to a universal income declaration form, which we went right over free and reduced lunch, which was one of the considerations, which is better than the SNAP, but not as good as a universal income declaration form. And this is also tied to the universal school lunch bill that hopefully the governor will sign soon, which the AOE is required to create this universal income form. It's already used by school districts that have universal school lunch, and it's used in other states, and it will replace the free and reduced lunch form. It will be required for all parents of all kids in the entire district. It's supposed to be a simple, easily accessible form. I don't know how many of you have tried to fill out the free and reduced lunch form, but it's really not easy. It's really not easy. I've tried to do it. It's not an easy form. I see Mary, like, it's terrible form. So this is supposed to be an easy form that everybody has to fill out. It's not based on whether you want the free lunch or not. It's just, you're a parent in the school, you gotta fill out the form, just like I do. So that will help get more kids counted based on their income to determine whether or not they are student in poverty. It doesn't actually change the percentage. It still is 185% of poverty, which is what SNAP enrollment is, and it's what free and reduced lunch enrollment is. But there's a lot of evidence that it will greatly increase the number of students who are counted, and therefore help students in poverty in districts that have a lot of students in poverty. Yes?
Is there a logical reason why just income tax returns is not used? Okay. I figure you don't have to answer it, but there must be a reason.
The main reason is confidentiality. Tax forms and tax income or tax information is confidential under federal law. We heard from the tax department, because that seems like a logical thing to do, right? And we
doing that anyway.
Right, we can't use it. Nobody can use it except for the tax department.
Okay.
Yeah, I wish we could.
Okay.
So currently our weights are mix of multiplication and addition. Turns out addition is simpler. That's why kids learn it before they learn the multiplication. We spent a lot of time talking about math and the difference between multiplying and adding, literally. So we changed all the weights to additive weights because it's easier. We also, the base 1 versus base 0 base, I told you about that. And we treated all the weights the same. So it used to be the weights were all kind of Mishigosh, and now it's all the same. We eliminated, and the House did this, so kudos to them. They eliminated the equalized pupil calculation and the equalization ratio. Currently, what we do is we take the number of pupils, like the number more or less, the actual number of kids, and then we apply the weights to it. And the weights, those are called equalized pupils. And then we take an equalization ratio and apply it to equalized pupils and come back to a number that's more equivalent to the count of the original kids. So it's this sort of convoluted system of equalizing the pupils and then taking equalized pupils and creating a ratio of equalized pupils, and it's confusing. I've already confused you. We got rid of that and just said we're going to use weighted pupils and we're not going to apply an equalization ratio. And I literally can show you the formula, but I almost included it on a slide, and then I was like, this will make their head spin, so I didn't. So it's just, as the AOE finance analyst, Brad James, said, Ruth, it's just math. So that makes it a simpler formula. Next slide, because I'm way over time.
And just a quick question about the base of 1 on
Yes.
secondary. Was ELL and the other weights on a base of 0 previously, and then and that was just a move?
Yes. It was bizarre how, and poverty and secondary weight were multiplicative, and the other weights were additive. There's really no reason. And if you multiply things, it exaggerates them, it multiplies them. So it made the poverty weight actually more impactful than the other weights. And it's not necessarily supposed to be, because the size is what's supposed to make it more impactful, not the order math function. Okay. Transition to the new weights. To implement the full weight changes in FY25. So y'all have a couple years to prepare. And there is a 5-year tax rate mitigation system. So in the first year, if a school district's tax rate goes up more than 5% under the new weights, because of the change in the weights, for the next 5 years, that school district's tax rate cannot go up more than 5% a year. So for 5 years, the most your tax rate can go up is 5%. And that is also what happened under Act 60 and Act 46. So it's a tried and true sort of threshold that districts are used to. And there is a tax rate review process. So for districts in the first year or any of those 5 years that have education funding that goes up more than 10%, so their budgets, the education funding part of their budget goes up more than 10%, they have to go to a tax rate review process, which is this committee made up of AOE, superintendents, and business managers to decide, why did your tax rate, or why did your education spending go up that much? It's basically to prevent school districts from gaming the system and saying, oh, we get this 5% thing, so let's increase our budget by a whole bunch and we won't be penalized on our tax rate. This also was something that was used in Act 46, and no district ever had to use it. So as soon as that was implemented, districts were like, oh, okay, I guess we can't do that. To the extent that they were thinking about it anyway. And I ended up getting some language in the budget that added some language that says that if districts have to increase their spending because of health and safety concerns, so if you discover PCB in one of your buildings and you have to spend a lot of money to mitigate the PCB, that will not be included in the 10%. Or if there are new federal or state requirements that cause you to have to spend more money, like universal school meals. So I got some language in the final budget that helps protect school districts a little bit more, so there are not these things out of your control. And as I told Steve, we suspend the spending threshold. The weird budget ballot language that if you remember, Jennifer knows what I'm talking about, the language when you vote that says like the convoluted thing about your school district budget and what happens to it that nobody understands, we suspended that. And then the hold harmless, which is this change, the percent change in average daily membership, which is another fancy way of saying enrollment. So during that 5-year period, all 3 of those are suspended. And we'll see what happens at the end of those 5 years. Okay, next slide. Oh, this is the one you've been waiting for, and of course I've talked so much that I get it. This is the estimated potential impact on Addison County District. Addison County is A, so I always got the top of the printout was always Addison County, so I could see immediately what was happening to my school districts, and you guys are first. So here's the bad news. ACSD does not benefit from these changes. ACSD is a district that does not have a lot of students living in poverty, does not have a lot of poor students, is not a really rural school district. It has a middle school and a high school, but pretty much all districts more or less do, so that kind of balances each other out. And it's a district that is more well off than most districts in the state. So you'll see ACSD, and I gave you the full printout in when I emailed you. This shows the state district by district impact. It's based on FY20. We did all of the analysis for FY20 because it was pre-pandemic and it didn't have all the funky things like the suspended threshold and the ESSER money and the pandemic craziness of students leaving schools. So we did the analysis based on FY20. For those of you paying attention to previous school budgets, that was still when there were the Act 46 tax benefits. So we took out those tax benefits in the analysis. So what this shows is an FY20 adjusted tax rate of 1.62 for ACSD. That's not what the actual ACSD tax rate was. I'm looking at Peter because I'm wondering if he even remembers. This has been adjusted so that we're having apples to apples comparison. So compared to what the FY adjusted rate was, if you implement the new pupil weights, the tax rate would go from 1.62 to 1.68. So it would be an increase in the tax rate. And this is where we were talking about, it's about taxing capacity. So ACSD would lose taxing capacity by about 6 cents or 4%. You can see the other Addison County districts, they're all pretty close. You know, it's not a huge impact. You should see the impact on CVU or Norwich if you're feeling bad right now. Look at that spreadsheet that I sent you. So Addison Northwest and Mount Abe, they have about a 2% sort of benefit from it because they do have more students living in poverty. And Mount Abe also has a couple school districts. Well, they might not anymore after last week, but they do right now have some schools that would be considered rural schools that would have the population density thing. Hold on a second, Nargis, I see you. So this is just an estimate. It's based on FY20. This is not what's really going to happen because the decisions are really up to you about what you're going to do with your budget. And then it's up to the voters about what they're going to do. And as school districts move in and out of, communities move in and out of school districts, that will also impact. Addison Northwest losing, Lincoln and Starksboro will have a huge impact on their budget, and these numbers will undoubtedly change because of that. Nargis.
Since this was started in 2020, is there an anticipated change in poverty rate because of the pandemic, or because this was done pre-pandemic, would that affect statewide, not just Addison County?
Yeah, so the poverty rate that's used is the FY20 poverty rate. We did adjust it for the new measurement. We actually used free and reduced lunch instead of SNAP, which is closer to what the universal income form would be. But actually, the poverty rate statewide is actually declining, even during the pandemic. So the anticipation is that hopefully it will continue to decline. And we did a lot of things in the legislative session this year that will hopefully help that continued decline. But and it has been declining for 20 years. So that's good news about Vermont. It's not true in most other states. So any questions on the potential impact on ACSD? I'm happy to talk about more details and go through the formula with anybody who chairs the finance committee. Who does that?
Chip.
Peter?
Chip.
Chip? We should have lunch. Okay, next slide.
And I'll figure it out, right?
Yeah, you will. I can help you. You're a smart guy. There's a lot of reports that are required. I just listed them because that we required a lot of reports. Next slide. That's it. Okay. Oh, no, wait. Are there any other questions before I stop talking? How long did it take me?
Well, you went over by 10
Oh,
minutes, but
oh,
that's
10 minutes. Oh,
We
yeah,
asked
questions,
though. Yeah, you asked
Yeah.
no, you did like, all right.
Chip.
You did a great job, because all of our questions are, why didn't we look at it this way? And people had different questions around the room, and it sounds like all of those questions were approached at some point.
Yeah.
And somebody had to come up with a solution to the answer to that, whether it's ignoring it, so, or I mean, not putting it into
Putting
it,
it off.
or
Yeah.
coming to a conclusion. So I think this helps us a lot, especially when we're in this 4% number. I'm glad we don't live in Norwich.
Yeah.
And CBU is going to have to figure it out.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, Chip, because and Peter can verify this, one of the goals of the task force was basically to ask all the questions so that we could say, yes, we looked at that. So the question about, gifted and talented, the question about whether or not schools are spending money in front that should be spent by other places. All of those questions we asked, and we felt like we got a lot of answers on. The math questions, the policy questions, the research questions. If you look at the report of the final report of the task force, we heard from hundreds and hundreds. We had 2 public forums. We heard from tons of superintendents, including yours. We just heard from a lot of people, and we asked a lot of questions. And frankly, we got a lot of guff for asking a lot of questions. But I think it's helpful because then when we do, we can say, yeah, we looked at that.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
So you have under required work groups and reports, the CTE funding and governance.
Yes.
Is that looking at the new form of doing their pupil count instead of doing the 6-semester rolling average?
Yeah, so the House put that provision in, and it is to look at the governance and financing of CTE education in the state. And yes, it will address those issues. It's a sort of the next step after the AOE report that came out last year. I think it was a year ago. And it's due next March. It's to be done by the Joint Fiscal Office. Probably they'll hire a consultant to do it. So stay tuned. But yes, it's supposed to address those kind of nutty issues with how our CTE centers are funded. Yeah, Jamie.
I hate to go back in time, but are the small school merger grants and the weighted, whatever you would solve for small schools, comparable?
They are comparable. We looked at which schools qualify under current law and which schools would qualify under the new weights. And I think there were 3, maybe 5 districts that were different that didn't qualify. And usually it was because they had been accepted in or grandfathered into the small schools grants. There was a lot of legislative games that were played with the small schools grants to try to get your school district in. So some powerful legislators sort of changed the definition a little bit so their school could be qualified as a small school, even though it wasn't really. And so those were some of the districts that maybe didn't get into the new weights. And also because of the population density. But it was really close. It was like maybe 3 to 5 districts that were different. There were a couple added and a couple subtracted. Does that make sense? The current system is so convoluted that this new system on small schools grants or small schools weights is much cleaner and probably and definitely more accurate. Barb, great.
Since Jamie brought up the merger and the small school, what's the rationale of, especially I can see if you're in a very dense area like in Burlington area and you have small schools because they're closer together, that kind of thing. But what always has kind of perplexed me is in the case of Monet qualifying for the,
Oh, yeah.
you know, for the small school weight, and say our rural school like not applying only because Middlebury and Burlington, Middlebury and Bristol is a little bit different size, right? Middlebury's larger, but they're rural and they're far apart, you know.
So a lot, it's just math and based on the size of the school district and the communities and sort of determining the population density. So yes, because Middlebury is much bigger than Bristol or Virgins, it sort of overweights the other districts. But that's why the merger support grants stay in there, is because those were based on the previous small schools grants that the district had gotten.
Right, but the merger grant doesn't change in value, does it, with inflation?
It doesn't change in value, but the weights stay the same until they're recalculated. And there is a provision for recalculating the weights and running the formula again and running the analysis is based on data that's now almost 20 years old. So there is a requirement that they be updated every 5 years. But other than that, no, they wouldn't change either. But bless you,
Okay.
it's roughly equivalent to what they would have been. Yeah. Okay, I've overstayed my welcome, so I'm gonna stop. Thank you all for your attention. Please let me know if you have more questions.
We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's fun to be here.
We're glad to see your good question. You've always been a good questioner. We're glad to see it put to good use.
Yes, I love to ask hard questions.
Yep.
I do have, not to do a little self-promo, but I do have my petition with me that I'm gathering signatures. So if anybody wants to sign it, I will stay for a couple minutes. Thank you all. Good luck with your work. I know it's not easy.
Thank you.
Do you have your petition? Yes, I will grab it. Okay.
All right. I think we're going to take E2 and put that on the agenda for next week.
Okay.
And Peter will do the intro for
We're on to our
E3.
discussion. So we have our IB coordinators, and Caitlin is going to join too, I believe.
I'll just introduce them.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Great. So we have one other IB coordinator, Brandy Corbett, who I think many of you know is serving as a fourth grade teacher in Shoreham this year. So we have 4 IB coordinators in the room. Joy Dobson, in the pandemic, has really been the PYP lead predominantly for 2 years across our 7 elementary schools. Courtney Cron and Pam Quinn each serve as half-time NYP coordinators. That's a new model for us this year. Pam has expertise in math and Courtney on the other side in the humanities, and having 2 of them allows one to have a greater presence in each of our NYP schools, the middle school and the high school. And Cindy Atkins is, .4 at this point, our .4 FTE, our DP coordinator. This team of leaders has really been a gift to work with, and they've carried so much of our IB design and support for teachers. They've been amazing liaisons between our teachers and our administrative team. When the Addison County Retired Educators Association reached out to me in the fall and asked if I would come and be a speaker to their group, I said that I would be happy to do it if I could bring some of my team with me. In the end, I can't remember if I had COVID symptoms or was home with a kid who was, there was some COVID-related reason why I wasn't able to attend that event, and I assured them that they would be in good hands with this team of educators, and the reviews of the presentation were so warm and wonderful that I asked if we could bring them to share the same information with all of you. So that is all I will say, and they will carry it from here.
Thank you for being here.
All right, so I'm going to kick this off. Yeah, this.
Scoot you around
Yeah,
each
thank
time.
you. Yeah, we'll just keep rotating.
Yes.
So we did edit this slightly, condensed it a little bit, but we certainly want to make sure that we are able to convey to you a clear understanding of all of our programs. And I don't have a clicker, so we'll just have to, yes, you're the one driving right now? Okay, great. So I'm not going to read the mission. You can see it up here and read it for yourselves. But I do want to address, before we get started, language. And International Baccalaureate is an organization. And the organization has 3 different programs, and we, within our district, are running all 3 programs. So we're known as a IB World District School, or IB World District, I should say. And there are a certain number of public schools throughout the United States. There are more and more that are becoming world districts, and we're one of those. And that's really exciting. But IB itself, when you say IB, you're talking about a really large organization. And we just had in our introduction our three different programs listed. What I love about this statement up here, these programs encourage students across the world to become active, compassionate, and lifelong learners who understand other people with their differences can also be right. And that's so powerful. And that's one of the focuses of the program, is to really try to expose students to different views, to realize that from different points of view, you can both be right. So next slide. So here are our 3 programs. The PYP program goes pre-K to 5, and it's very interdisciplinary, and Joy will be talking about that real quickly. Middle years program, MYP, I should be saying these acronyms and applying them for you, is grades 6 through 10, and the 2 middle years program coordinators will talk about that, and that's interdisciplinary based. And then the diploma program, DP program, is the end of the 3, and it's just grades 11 and 12. And each of these 3 are there's different pieces. They're structured differently, and so you'll hear a little bit about that. But what's really unique is that we have this overall program, that there's pieces that tie together, and the learner profile is one of them. There's 10 attributes of the learner profile. So our students, ideally, when they start in pre-K or K, and they start hearing about the learner profile and different pieces of it, that language becomes consistent throughout. And also approaches to learning, and you'll hear a little bit about that, but these transferable skills, communication, self-management, there's more specific pieces within those, but again, students starting in the system will hear these early on, and they'll continue to hear about them throughout their journey, and that's really powerful as well. So we're different, but there's common threads, and now I'll pass it over to Joy.
Okay. All right, thanks. Yeah, so the primary years program consists of it's transdisciplinary learning, and within the program, we have different inquiry units that the teachers have developed. And you'll notice that in preschool and kindergarten, they have 4 units, those each year. Those units usually run between 8 and 12 weeks throughout the year. And then in grades 1 through 5, there's 6 units. All of these units are built around some themes, and I'll show you an example a little bit in a couple slides. But the 1 through 5 grade units, they run about 8 weeks. Right, and they start at the first day of school, and they go out throughout the whole school, or the whole school year. I do want to note that in addition to the grade level teams building their units, also our arts and movement and world language teams have also developed units. So they have units of inquiry that they are teaching, and they also have what we call annexes. And an annex is a way in which they can attach to a classroom unit through one line of inquiry. So they'll follow a central idea and they'll unpack it through a line of inquiry. And this allows for the connection between all of our different subject areas, right? Unpacking these central ideas and lines of inquiry together. Next slide. Will, thanks. All right, so it's a transdisciplinary program, and we have 5 essentials in the PYP. And so the 5 are listed here: the knowledge, the concepts, action, the approaches to learning, and the learner profile. So I'm just going to draw a connection to what Senator Hardy was talking about. If you were my class, and we were taking on the task force, we would be using all 5 of these essentials, right? So we have our knowledge base, and that's sort of our content area. And she kept saying, we've got to do some math, right? But as you listen to her explanation, you can hear the social aspects that are coming across, right? And so the social studies, and then there's communication and there's writing. So there's all of that subject area that's happening within the task force. We've got some large concepts like form and function, change, right? That's all embedded in the learning and in the work. Action for the PYP can look as simple as the child going home and being really excited and talking to mom or talking to younger siblings and saying, guess what we're doing in school? And they drag that backpack back into school with all the books from the bookshelf, right? Or, as we see in this task force, it's really then advocating for change, advocating for different groups of people to have the funding needed for a well education. The approaches to learning are really skills, and it's skills to be lifelong learners. So in the task force, as I listen, I'm thinking about the skills of research right away, and the ability to communicate, and the ability to problem solve. All of those are skills that are embedded into our units, and we're hoping that we can develop these lifelong learners. And last, the learner profile, as was stated earlier, that goes across all of our programs. And the learner profile is where children are, really exploring and becoming, like, what is it to be caring, and what is it to be knowledgeable, or to be a risk taker, to be a communicator. And in the task force, we can see all of those things coming to the surface. Okay, I'll let you take it on. I was so excited to hear your presentation. I was like, that's what we do. All right.
I'm so excited to hear that.
And there you go. Okay. All right. Our program of inquiry, which is basically our units that we have, right, are all built on state and national standards. The unit of inquiry, the basis of it, is really calling out the science and the social studies. So you see those things embedded. Those, when we started writing, those were the first steps that we made. Like, what's our science standards? What are our social studies standards? And then we started from there, and then we began to build. All right. And we have embedded mathematics and language arts. And this year we have a real I won't say it's just this year. It started earlier, but you really see the teams, the grade level teams, really investing in embedding all of the language arts standards within the units. And so that work has begun. It's really exciting. And we have teachers giving examples of how they're doing that and sharing that with their teams and other colleagues within the building. And I know we're moving into curriculum camp in June, and that will be an ongoing focus of curriculum camp. What I did here is I created a slide where you could see the theme, who we are, in 3 different grade levels. What we do is we have a theme, and you'll notice that in each grade level, they will pick what we call semicolon to semicolon. So the phrase. So in 4th grade, I'm not sure you can see it way back there, but it says, it's an inquiry into nature of self, beliefs and values. And then the bolded part there is personal, physical, social, and spiritual health. Right? So 4th grade is focusing on this particular part of who we are. But as kindergarten, 3rd grade, and 4th grade develop their unit, they each, focusing on their own phrase, build a central idea, 3 lines of inquiry that are tied to a concept. And then they unpack. We have the related concepts that give you a little hint of where it sits, if it's a science more driven or social studies driven unit, right? And you can see body systems right away, the science. And over here we have conflict and cooperation and relationships. You'll see that in the social studies. We have these lines of inquiry in which we unpack, right? And that is the way that we unpack this unit with students, right? So the art, music, and the physical education and social emotional learning is embedded. It's embedded through the annexes. And the social emotional learning is really, really tied to not only the lines of inquiry, right, when we start to unpack them, but also when you when we dig into the learner profile and the skills, those approaches to learning. And the approaches to learning, one of the categories is self-management, another one is communication, right? And we find really strongly in those two areas that we can explicitly teach and practice social emotional skills, right, for students. Okay, my time is up. They gave me just 5 minutes.
I have a true story about the PYP, which is that I coach youth soccer, and last spring I was coaching, it's club soccer, and so we have kids from all the towns in the district, and there was a group of, I think what would have been 3rd grade boys comparing who had where we are in place and time yet. So kids from all around the district, oh, have you had this unit? And I can't remember, what the topic or the specific theme, Joy probably knows, but that they were excited in comparing this common experience across the towns. It was cool. Pam and I are going to present, I'm Courtney, this is Pam, about the MYP. The MYP, like the PYP and the DP, focuses on the whole child. It's interdisciplinary, so students are getting out of that transdisciplinary model. They're getting into a more, I don't want to say siloed, but they're going into subject-specific classrooms, and we're trying to help them make connections across the disciplines still. In ACSD, the PYP is for grades 6 to 10, and that model can be configured differently depending on your school or your district. Some districts have a MYP that starts as early as 5th grade. We used to start in 7th grade. This year we start in 6th grade. Some schools have like a standalone 9-10 MYP that doesn't connect to a middle school. And something I think that's unique about ACSD is we applied for authorization to have the MYP as a partner school between MUMS and MUHS. So we said we don't want to be 2 different schools with 2 different models where the principals at the time applied as partners and committed to collaborating across the 2 buildings, having 6 through 10 meetings yearly and regularly so that we can really align vertically and horizontally what we're doing in the 2 buildings. Our middle school can still be developmentally appropriate, have its own structures, its own practices, but our educators across the 2 buildings can come together and say, where are we headed and how can we back that all the way up now to 6th grade? So there's the collaboration across the 2 buildings, which I think has, I think it's gone really far in the past 5 years, and I think there's a lot to grow there as well. At a recent MUHS faculty meeting, I heard teachers say, we need to do more of that over longer chunks of time. Our meetings are pretty short. And I also heard them say, and we've got to start talking to the PYP teachers again. So I think there's room for growth there. We also have a really strong model of collaboration. I would say probably one of the greatest benefits of the MYP and what it's brought to our district is the collaborative practices we've put in place. At MUHS and MUMS, teachers of the same subject and same grade level collaborate every other day, usually, to talk about what is the guaranteed viable curriculum we're offering our students. Early on, Caitlin had us partner with the Tarrant Institute out of UVM, and we worked with Jeannie Phillips to establish what does it look like to collaborate as professionals, how can we use protocols from the School Reform Institute to guide our work, to look at student outcomes, to share our peer work, to have hard conversations, and to negotiate our curriculum, which is a hard thing to do because our teachers write and design our units themselves. We have a framework from the IB, but we write our own units, and if you're in your own classroom, in your own silo, and you get to choose everything you want to do, that's still a really hard job. But then when you're negotiating that with 6 to 10 other colleagues across 2 buildings and within your department, it requires a lot of professional hard work and really blood, sweat, and tears. But I think what the research shows is that it leads to better outcomes for students because when there's more minds and more perspectives at the table, especially at MUHS where we embed special educators into our collaborative meetings, I think the outcomes are better for students. So the framework is based, the MYP framework that teachers write units under is based on research best practices. And that those are phrases that are easy to say. But just to give you some specific examples, the work of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins really coined this term universal by design, or the idea of backwards design. So if we have an instructional unit, where do we want our kids to go based on the local state standards Joy was talking about, and based on what we want them to know and understand and be able to do? So our teachers identify what is the end point of this unit, and then they back it up. What are the skills we want students to have? What are the learning experiences we want them to have? What are the hands-on inquiry-based opportunities we're going to give them? All the way back to the beginning, which is also based on the work of Wiggins and McTighe. How are you going to have essential questions, or the MYP calls them inquiry questions, to really hook students, for them to sort of organize all of this thinking under? So what is the big essential inquiry that each day and each task and each explicit skill instruction fits under, so students are constantly attaching their facts and their content back to bigger concepts? The reason for that is that facts aren't really transferable over space and time. We have them on our cell phones, we walk around with them all day long, but if you can learn about these facts and information through big concepts, you're more likely to transfer that learning to other settings. And then just the last, I could go on and on, there's one more bullet that I think is an asset of the MYP, is its proficiency-based model, which aligns with the state of Vermont's, or the AOE's requirements around proficiency-based teaching and learning. In a proficiency-based model, students aren't assessed against each other. They're assessed against a clear set of expectations with learning scales or rubrics that really articulate, here's where you are in the MYP. We have a 0 to 8 scale. Here's where you are on this scale. And here are the really explicit things you need to do to move up on this scale. Each of our 8 subjects has 4 consistent criteria or proficiencies that stay the same from 6th to 10th grade. So we know that, and we can work with students coming in. At the 6th grade level, it takes a lot of time, and we found that out this year. Teachers are looking at these learning scales with students, defining the criteria, helping them move through the very basic levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which is really sort of like levels of critical and creative thinking. And then by 10th grade, we're asking them to do a lot higher level thinking against the same criteria, which sounds a little complicated, but not as complicated as per pupil weighting factors. So those are my main highlights. I'm going to turn it over to Pam, because she has some more like concrete examples of what this could look like.
Thank you. I was thinking, there's over 100 years of teaching experience with the 4 of us standing up here right now, which is pretty impressive. That's
pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I think all in this
more like
district. Right?
Dirt. I feel like I'm the weak link here. I feel like I
Actually, this might be 100.
I'm just here to say that all 3 of them are not my previous students.
This is my first year being a coordinator, and so I have a couple of shorter slides and then some kind of experiences from being a math teacher at MUMS that I can share with you about how this actually kind of comes into play. So first of all, we talked about it being interdisciplinary, and Courtney mentioned the fact that we have these 6 global contexts, and the reason we have those, they're shared through whatever class you're in, if you're in science or math or individuals and societies, PE and wellness, it's all the same. And it's a way for us to all emphasize how are we going to use this learning. So it's not just about the content or the skills anymore. Courtney mentioned we have that at our fingertips in our phones, but it's how do we teach them how to analyze this information, how to utilize this information, how to make good choices with this information. And so we can do that by stepping outside of just doing it in our classroom because it's what we're supposed to teach. So we do that, and we also have at least once a year, it can be more, we're working on those, interdisciplinary units where at least 2, but it can be as many as you want, can collaborate on a unit. And again, it gets rid of those silos that Courtney was talking about. You know, I can't talk about math in my language arts class, you know, language literature, I have to do that only in the class that I'm assigned. So we try and bridge those gaps, and that learning is learning, and it happens all over the school, and we try to make those connections, because when you're outside of the school, that's what's going to happen. You want to be able to transfer it. So one of the examples that I remember from teaching is we did a unit. You choose a global context when you're designing a unit, and we were looking at fairness and development, and the math content was ratios, but what we looked at ended up being the ADA, American with Disabilities, requirements for building wheelchair ramps. And so the students had to investigate that, look into what the requirements were, and then their assessment was they were given a house with dimensions, and they needed to design a ramp. And it needed to meet those requirements, and they needed to justify the placement, whether it needed a switchback, which if any of you have familiarity with that. So some funny conversations happened, because when they were looking at justifying where their placement was, some of them had the wheelchair ramps going right out into the road. So we had to have some conversations about why that wouldn't be a good idea. Or, you know, if they didn't calculate correctly and had a super steep ramp, you know, the arm strength of, you know, somebody getting up there could be quite challenging. So it made it so much more real for them to have something like that to hook it onto. And then they started coming in with stories about, oh, I saw the ramp at this place. Are you sure that's up to code? Yeah. And so it was just a great way for them to look outside the classroom instead of just doing ratios, kind of standalone unit, little skill, didn't go anywhere. Now it goes somewhere, and they'll be thinking about that. And I love that they would come back in and talk about the ramps that they had seen and question it and see if they could make it better. See, I brought notes just to make sure I didn't forget anything. All right, so you can go to the next one, please, Will. Thank you. This is an exciting one. This just happened recently, and I don't know if any of you were able to get to the student showcase of the personal projects, but this is something that starts in the end of their 9th grade year, and it's completely their choice passion project. You're smiling. Do you remember what yours was?
Oh, I know. It was cults.
That's a really weird one. Like, I made
totally
a database
fascinating.
and everything. So, yeah, that was it. So it can be whatever your choice was. That's fine. Yeah, you sure can. And it ends up that they have a showcase. There is a little video, but I think you're welcome to see that. It's on the website. I believe it's on there.
Website.
Yeah. But basically, they get to have a product that demonstrates their learning. And so they have an inquiry, they have an action plan, and they have reflection on it. That's their part of it. But the fun part is this showcase, and we had it just last week, I believe. Time flies a little bit, but and it's an amazing energy and buzz when you walk into the room. We had some kids who were a little nervous about presenting, but it's such a great experience for them to have people stop by their little booth and have them explain what their passion was and what they learned and what they reflected on. And so it's a great way for the ATL skills that were mentioned, the approaches to learning, and the learner profile attributes to all culminate and be present for this showcase. So I highly recommend stopping by. Hopefully we can have it every year from now on. But it's an excellent way to get in choice, and like I said, the approaches to learning and the learner profile skills all in one project for them. All right.
Okay,
It's a
DP.
perfect bridge to the DP.
Perfect bridge to the DP. I think it's great, the personal project, all students experience that, and it is really powerful for them to show up and make eye contact and communicate and talk about their work, and that all students do that. So the diploma program, grades 11 and 12, seems like the deeper I get into this, the more passionate I get about it. And I just want to say there's so many layers to this that please contact me if you want to have conversations down the road. I'm happy to do that. But just like the MYP circle, you could see now there's specific subject areas in the diploma program. What's really different about the diploma program is that instead of the teachers creating the curriculum is developed by IB. It's the first time in the 3 levels that that's the case. We've analyzed the curriculum. It aligns with our state standards. There's no surprises there. And I think instead of going into a full diploma scenario, I want to go to the next slide instead, and then we'll come kind of back to that. This is our second year, and looking at the current seniors, 99% of the seniors have taken at least one DP class. And we could break that down into other percentages, but majority of the courses offered in grades 11 and 12 are diploma program classes, and students can take them for MUHS credit. I could be a student and want to take chemistry junior year 1 chemistry, and then as a senior take physics year 1. You could go through that 2 years and have it traditionally look like what probably we all remember high school looking like, if that's what you wanted to do. 40% of the current senior class earned at least one course certificate. And then almost a quarter of the current senior class, they are diploma candidates and looking to earn the full diploma. We just finished exams on Friday. It's 3.5 weeks of exams for the seniors. It's very different than other exam situations. Each course might have 2 or 3. This year they have some mitigations because of COVID. They reduced in some subject areas how many tests, they call them papers, students would have to take. But typically it's more like 3 exams instead of 2, but this year most of them were just 2. But anyways, a quarter of the students are full diploma candidates. So now let's go back to that other slide. And for the students that choose at the end of grade 10, they finish their personal project. It's their first taste of having this kind of public event, and they get to choose their own project. They may then decide they want to be a full diploma candidate. They're intrigued by carrying 6 subjects. They have to have 3 higher level and 3 standard level courses in their coursework, and there's some details there that I'm going to skip over. But what full diploma candidates have to also do is complete a year of theory of knowledge, which for MUHS credit, students also have a theory of knowledge class, but it's not the diploma program class. And they have to complete on their own an extended essay, but we're really fortunate that as juniors first semester, they also are enrolled in a research and writing class that really helps to prepare them for that. But then for the rest of that, they're on their own. They have a supervisor that they're assigned, so there are supports in place. And then creativity, activity, service is CAS is the acronym, and they need to have 21 different experiences over the 2 years. And again, there's details with all this that I just don't want to go into right now. Boston Celtics tipped off about 25 minutes ago, and I'm still here. So lots of details. The short of it, you could be a full diploma candidate, which has a lot of requirements to meet. You could be a student we've had some students that wanted to continue with courses in the Hanford Career Center, but also took as many as 4 HLs. Most colleges give credit for HL courses, the higher level courses. And so there's lots of different ways to choose your path. And then we have students who took SL and HL courses, but might not have had any desire to earn certificates at all. If you're earning a certificate, or if you're a full diploma candidate, you have to take the exams at the end of your senior year. There's no choice about that. If you're in a diploma class, you have to also do, and this is what's really neat, and we can go 2 slides ahead. Internal assessments are part of a student earning points towards their diploma. And we have all of these public events. In the music they have to perform group and solo. I don't know if any of you took time to go to the art exhibit. It was really powerful. And IB, and this is true across all programs, it's a lot of reflection, getting students to reflect on their experiences. And let's see, this is theory of knowledge, and they just did this, the current juniors just did this last week, where they had to have their projects ready, and it was an in-school event. Next slide. So there's oh, and coming up Thursday, next Tuesday, next week is the colloquium for the extended essay. That will be the grade, it's called the colloquium for the extended essay, and colloquium meaning to bring, looking at the students' work and public, people coming in and just talking to them. Again, there'll be tables set up in the gym, and the students will have their work as it is right now. They have probably just outlines, and it's a great way for them to explain to people what they're researching. And it was really valuable for the students to hear from adults in the community. They said, oh, hey, have you thought about checking out this source? Or have you gone and talked to this person and interviewed them? It was really powerful for the students. They got a lot out of it, and that's next week. But here in every class, usually in year 2, students have to do these internal assessments that then I had about 360 pieces of work at the end of, towards the end of April that I had to have uploaded to IB. And it's the students' work over the 2-year journey. And just all sorts of neat topics. Some of these, I mean, this one clearly was from a math class, modeling solar energy production. Here's a chemistry one that a current junior is, I think that's an EE right now, an extended essay right now, effects of temperature on combustion rate. But all of these are student driven, and so there's a lot of engagement. And just as a side note, one of our students who went off to the University of Michigan, they looked at her extended essay and other IA topics, and they ended up giving her, they have a requirement of doing research as undergrads, and they gave her credit towards her research based on her extended essay and some of her internal assessments. So I thought that was really neat. Next slide. So strengths for the program, and as I'm looking at this, I want to just double check that I've said everything about the diploma program that I want to, because I was talking rapidly there. Students have to complete an internal assessment that I was talking about and the May exams. IB is the one that teachers score the internal assessments, but I send them in as well, and then IB scores them. So it's a great way, the teachers, or as a school, we get feedback from IB. The teachers get feedback from IB about, boy, you were not critical enough in your scoring, or you did not use the rubric correctly, you seem to be overlooking this criterion. And so teachers do get feedback from the IB as well in their assessment practices. And then IB decides in early July, they will send out the scores and whether or not students have diplomas, and they will have it sent to them. So strengths of our district. Coherence of curriculum across schools and classrooms is huge. That's what this has allowed us to do. Sure, districts could try to do this on their own. It takes years and years, and with turnover, you're always like spinning wheels. I mean, we've really made huge advances with having consistency in the curriculum. Proficiency-based grading, that's another thing that many school districts have been struggling to try to figure out and come up with a system that is not only relevant, but fair, equitable, and effective. And this provides us with that vehicle. Shared research framework, IB is always, I'm always calling IB Answers for support with a lot of my detailed work. They're always there to help us. Common language, when we said that there's the approaches to learning, there's also IB command terms. So in 4th grade, if teachers start to use the same differentiate between, students will start to, they'll get that understanding of what differentiate means, but then when teachers in 8th grade use that, or 10th grade, it's the same. There's consistency. So we all are using the same command terms in a similar way. IB keeps us informed about current practices. Collaboration is huge. The MIP and the PYP could not survive without collaboration. It's critical to have that, and like Courtney said, that's provides an equitable experience for students to make sure that we're all on the same page. Oops, that was the last one as well. So I guess we would take questions if you have any. I know that was really fast, but we tried to stay short.
Thank you. Questions?
One of the questions I had, and one of the board members asked it before, and you referred them to this presentation, was if you have a new teacher coming into the district who's not IB, initiated, what does that mean and how do you deal with it? I don't know whose question that was, but was it yours, Barb?
Yeah. I was actually thinking when Barb asked that, we could touch on it in this presentation, but I think back to the collaborative practices, when it's working well and when it's happening the way it should, and I would say there's pockets in our district where the collaboration is like state of the art, if that's possible. It's so strong in these pockets. When a new teacher comes in, that team, whether it's a grade level team in the PYP or the individuals and societies department at one of our secondary schools, they can wrap around that new teacher, and we've seen it happen, and bring them in and sort of bring them up in a more authentic way, I think, than any external training could, which isn't to say they might not also go and have an external training at some point, but I think where it's going well, our local teachers are the super experts, I would say.
I would add to that, that I think you might have mentioned in your question, the whole department of the math department leaving, and I was like, okay, so who's going to wrap around them? One of the other things that's a benefit is the unit planners that we use are housed in Manage Back, and we have a Google Drive of support documents. So the teachers coming in have access to all the previous work because of the MYP framework that we've written it under. So that's helpful.
And then at the DP level, each teacher does have to be trained. It doesn't have to happen immediately. It's certainly nice if, let's say, a new math teacher comes in, there's already a math teacher who may be teaching that or has taught that subject to help support them. That's not always the case. We had 2 new math hires last year. They both had to get trained, and they were wonderful. They got trained very early on. I think it was early September, and they both got trained. But certainly IB understands that you're going to have new faculty, you're going to have turnover, so they don't expect it to happen immediately. But I feel like we all put a lot of time into teacher support as well, and so that piece is important.
Just following up a little bit on that. So when there's a large turnover, are you concerned? Do you see some challenges there? Since, over this, it looks like there's quite a few teachers that are going to be new come this fall. And what do you see as the challenges there?
It's really hard.
Yeah.
It stinks, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially with the whole department. I think the challenges are obvious. You all discussed them sort of at length, and I think what remains, like Pam said, are the units that have been collaboratively designed over time. Those remain. The coordinators remain, and I think I speak for all of us when I say we work individually one-on-one with teachers every day to support them. And I think the other model that we've been leaning into that's really effective is instead of sending individual folks out to train, at least in the MYP, right now, in fact, we have a trainer here who's a principal in Montreal training our high school math department. So to bring one person here to look at our context and work with a group of folks instead of sending individuals all over separately is pretty powerful. So the challenges you bring up, I think, are they are what they are, and I think we're lucky to have some of the supports in place we can to triage the situation.
Thank you.
When looking at the PYP collaborative teams and thinking about next year, when you take a look at those teams are really solid, and we'll have new hires come onto those teams, but the teams have their units right? And they have taught those units before, and so bringing somebody new in, they're not coming in with no supports, right? Even if they were hired in a school where they're the only, third grade teacher, the only second grade teacher, they have the whole collaborative team of second grade and third grade teachers to support them.
This, Mary had this other
Yes,
hand.
I'm curious, I know you talked a little bit about annexes and kind of arts and sort of specials and incorporating that into the PYP. I'm curious how in the secondary schools in the MYP and DP, how art and music are treated and whether or not there's kind of coordination with the sort of depth of inquiries. And the reason I ask is because, we've heard from families and students that there are students who end up either feeling like they don't have room for it in their schedules, or that art or music has become more sort of academically focused rather than just enjoying a creative process. And I'm just wondering how you're tangoing with that issue and how you guys treat those particular subjects.
MYP, when they say they're a whole child model, they do stress and emphasis on treating all 8 of those subjects equally, which I think is a shift from our traditional, we have our core subjects, and then some students take art and some students take music, some students take language acquisition. Instead, now we have pretty much all students taking all of those subjects at the middle school. At the high school, there's subject group flexibility, so based on your context and your school's needs, you can cut 2 of those subjects if you think it's the best thing for your context. At the high school, we actually don't offer the official MYP Arts and Design. We still offer Arts and Design at the high school, but students aren't required to take them. And the thinking there is that traditionally, especially in the lower grades, 6, 7, 8, the demographic of student you see taking art and music and language acquisition tends to be imbalanced, I think, and this way we're exposing kids to all of those subjects, and then as they get to high school, they have more choice about where they want to choose their credits and spend their time. As far as that more academic part, someone said this, the IB is they ask us to reflect all the time. And I think what students are probably responding to is teachers asking them to reflect on their performance or reflect on their art piece. And I think we're still working to figure out how can we reflect in ways that aren't writing. I think teachers, it's a go-to thing, right? Let's write about it and then I can read it. And I think there's a lot of ways to reflect. And we could look there and probably fine-tune it.
I was going to say that last part as well. In grades 11 and 12, probably the arts is one area where there's more non-DP courses available to students. If you are a full diploma candidate, you do have a really full schedule, and it sometimes comes down to having to make tough choices. And yeah, it's an 8-period day, and tough choices, we have to make them in lots of different ways along the way, and that has to happen, yeah.
No problem, I'm just behind you.
The other thing, I was just going to add about the 8 subject groups in the MYP. There's a minimum number of hours you have to meet, so it's actually 50 hours per subject. So the MYP doesn't say treat all of the subjects equally with the same amount of time. It's more of a provide this minimum amount of exposure in this subject, and you figure out locally how you're going to do that. That has proven to be easier said than done, just with scheduling constraints. How do you design that? But it's not run all 8 all year. It's give exposure to all 8. Sorry, Susan.
That's okay, no problem. So my question is one that has been asked in the past, and may or may not have necessarily been answered with as much clarity as some might like. It revolves around students that are on IEPs. So anybody with a special needs, whether it's a specific learning disability, intensive learning disability, whatever, how how does that learning fit into IB? I mean, I've done the theory of knowledge class, so I know how intense that is. So I'm wondering, how do these students work through the IB program?
The answer's really different at the different
Yeah, I
programs.
think it is
So,
different than different programs. So at the in the primary years program, it's IB for all, right? So we have, if you think about the classroom as a general ed classroom, right, where students are given provided support and access, right, for success in the classroom, then that is what we do it. So there isn't, that support that you would imagine coming into mathematics is the same thing that's coming in, during these inquiry units. So that same level of support is there for students, right?
The MYP says we can't exclude anyone from the MYP, so we have to leave it open and accessible to all students. But it's up to us locally and our team or a student on an IEP's team to determine for that student how they will or won't participate in the program, whether that's dropping a subject or 2 subjects, and that would be our local decision. How are we going to employ that, and what are our parameters going to be? And I would say that's, from where I sit, shifted a little bit over the last 5 years, and I think we're probably still figuring out how do we determine for each student how are they participating. And the other thing I would say is we have these, this is a question I get a lot, we do have these proficiencies and these rubrics, and so how does a student on an IEP get assessed against those rubrics? And some of the work, I think it was 1.5 years ago that we really leaned into, was the work of Leanne Young and her assessment models for equity and students with learning differences. And I think her work aligns really well with any coordinated curriculum model, whether it's the MYP model or a different school's coordinated curriculum and proficiency system. But if you know what your curriculum is and you know what your criteria are, then you can have like a systemic way of modifying those criteria for students, as opposed to each classroom having their own criteria, each classroom having their own curriculum. It's really hard, I think, to modify either assessment expectations or a curriculum for students when it's like a ping pong system of inconsistencies. So I think having a coordinated curriculum and a coordinated assessment system sets us up to do that work well, and I think we're still, like we are with all of this, we're still refining it.
But I would add that we're lucky enough that in the NYP, we're still creating our curriculum. So we've been using Universal Design for Learning this year in our professional development, which is increasing our ability to have access for everyone. And so it's increasing access not just for kids on IEPs, but for all students. So that's another piece that's really helpful.
And I would add, I would just edit your question. It's not about how are we supporting special ed students in the IB program. It's just how are we supporting special ed students in our curriculum. It really has nothing to do with IB, because actually the IB, by having these 3 programs, have given us, like Courtney was just saying, I'm not going to stand here and repeat the whole thing, but clear curriculum and with clear proficiencies. Now you can do the work that needs to be done to support the special ed students, rather than every classroom you go into, everything changing, expectations are all over the place. I just, like I said, just finished giving exams. We haven't had, in 2 years so far, we haven't had a student who's a special ed student try to earn the diploma, but I did have 5 students on 504 plans, and IB, I work with them early on in the fall, and they're very accommodating at giving students extra time, allowing students to use word processors, all sorts of accommodations. So that's something that, I'm supporting the student by contacting IB and working between the two. Yeah.
And it's really cool to see the silos disappear, and for kindergarten teachers and high school teachers to understand the breadth and depth of knowledge as it increases from kindergarten through high school, just to have that knowledge base to know where they have come from or where they need to go is really crucial in a student's development.
And that's what I was saying, now that every year as we get further into this, I'm becoming more passionate about it. And I just think, I think as a school board, we can only ask that when someone from the community starts to complain and says, oh, it's IB, for you just to ask the question, what do you mean by that? Because that's such a broad statement. IB is an organization, and like we just talked about, the first two levels, the teachers are actually creating the curriculum. So what is the complaint about? Just to get specificity so we can hear people and work on it.
There you
I guess this is a specific question to the Pupil program, but I just wanted to ask what specifically is being done to mitigate stress levels at I guess the high school level, and are there new strategies being brought into that, or are there new ideas about how it can the stress situation at the high school can be made?
Yeah, the students who are full diploma candidates, they are stressed, and that doesn't help you for me to stand here and say that, but stress is a reality in that program. And I know I've been doing a lot of reading and research, like what are schools doing to try to relieve that stress? Because for full diploma candidates, we cannot get rid of the extended essay. We cannot get rid of CAS. So there's only so much we can do, but somehow we have to find a way to support students who are feeling the stress. Because they're asked to do a lot. They have a lot going on at the same time. And we want them playing sports, we want them to take part in activities, but they have very full days, and trying to figure out how to balance that is really difficult. So I guess in my answer to you, we know that it's really stressful, but I don't have a magical answer. But certainly if students have ideas, we'd love to hear some possibilities.
But yeah, I guess that could be, I think, communicated more openly. There could be more channels of doing that. Just because I think at some point it's whatever you can say that, oh, it is stressful, and that is the reality of high school, and whether we were doing AP or IB, it would be stressful, but at some point I feel like there has to be more communication, and also just things as simple as having TOK not graded as part of a transcript, or having a proficiency grade for that. I think it just, something needs to change a little bit, because while I really love the diploma program and I love my classes, it's, every week you get through the week and then you're like, it can't get harder, and then it gets harder. And so it just, especially communication, because I think sometimes it's just not felt in the classes, it's just not felt that there's communication at all.
Justin, do you want to add to that?
Oh, yeah, just a couple of specifics, and not to get too far into the weeds, but I think there are a few things that are specific to the diploma programs, and you and I have talked about one of them. I think there's a few things that we have control over, right? And so personal fitness course is one of them. That's required of all students, so it's not unique to the diploma program students, but when you have this coursework that you're doing, which takes much of your day, and then we add on things beyond that, it gets pretty intense. So that's a locally imposed piece of potentially the stress. We have typically had a 7-credit rule at the high school, so that's another piece. I think also the distribution of courses we have. We offer, I think, a wide range of courses, and I wonder about if that number were to decrease, so we had maybe more sections of some courses. I think that would make scheduling easier. It would be, on the other hand, it would mean not offering something that students like you might be really passionate about. But if there were 2 sections or more students in a particular course, I think that might be a way to potentially alleviate the stress. I'm not in any way opposing, it is a very challenging program, but I think there are changes that we could entertain potentially, certainly with feedback from students that might help that a bit.
Yeah, and I do want to make it clear that I'm not in any way like saying that again, like that thing he says like IB is bad or anything, because I genuinely really enjoy my courses and I find them really interesting, and I enjoy that a lot, but also there's that aspect of I want to be able to enjoy them and not to, you know, I have my homework with me, so there's that, you know, like there's always this kind of thing of like, if you can be doing something, you can be doing work, and yeah, I appreciate things like that, things like the fitness requirement was there's a half credit to get done somewhere. I think the IB program is really useful. I'm going to graduate with like 7 history credits out of like 4 usually. So, and like I've been waived for college courses or waived for prerequisites to take a college course, which mostly because of IB. But it's just that stress aspect that can really kind of weigh down the really great things about the course.
All right.
Last question. What, last question, okay. And this is kind of getting back to kids with special needs as far as curriculum. And so I've had experience in moms, you know, subbing, and so I've been like a special educator helping that, and then helping those same kids in the regular classroom. And the experience that I see is they shut down in that classroom, right? Because they don't know the material. It's better to maybe act bad or than to, you know, not know and be considered, you know, dumb, you know, in their mind, that kind of thing. So, you know, how are we getting our arms around that? Because of all my experience, that's what I've walked away with, and it's kind of heartbreaking, you know, working maybe one-on-one, and they're really willing to let me work with them, but then in the classroom setting, they don't really want you coming up and helping them, and they just don't do the work.
I think Peter started out this very long superintendent's report, if that's what we're still in, item E, with talking about the difference between, I think that's what we're still in.
We are, yep.
He was talking about the difference, or like this tension between social emotional learning and curriculum, and whether, I think it was the MYP units, or just other random units, perhaps also designed off the work of Wiggins and McTighe, that were following the state standards, which we have to do to some extent. I think we'd be feeling that tension. There are some aspects of the MYP that I think, maybe the rubrics, for example, that we could open up, or like Pam said, if we could make our units, our tier 1 more universal and more accessible, it might alleviate some of that. And then I just also want to say that's a real tension, for sure. And it was when I taught at MUMS 9 years ago, and it definitely is now.
Yeah.
Would you add anything to that?
Conversations about how we use our intervention, so as kind of a pre-teaching model, so that they have as much opportunity as possible to kind of process some of the information before they head into that math class, and then the teachers understanding that and giving them immediately an opportunity to be successful, so they feel like, oh, I've got this. So the teachers are very skilled at varying their levels of questioning based on students.
I think Chip went outside for a second.
Oh, I thought somebody fell.
I thought someone fell.
Yeah.
No, just a board member.
Just a
minute.
What I've seen though is when I'm working one-on-one, the level that they're working at is like, it could be 2nd grade level or 3rd grade level. And then they're in the classroom, maybe trying to do 6th or 7th grade level. And it's a large gap.
It is a large gap, and we have been trying to address that for a long time.
Yeah.
And so, you know, trying to have a variety of entry points. We have these things called low floor, high ceiling tasks because you have such huge diversity of capability, as you mentioned. So if you have really good tasks that have been collaboratively developed, then you have entry points for anybody at any level. So that's what we aspire to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's really great to see you all in one place. All right, we're on to F, report of the board. I'm not sure what this one is, capital reserve fund. Logan? Is this you?
This is me.
Okay.
I was
How about it?
unclear whether or not this got posted to board pack this afternoon. I never got confirmation from Sharon, so Yes. you guys might not know about this.
It's on there.
It's on there.
All right, I brought copies just in case. It's on there, great. So, when was this, in January?
Do you have copies of it, folks?
Yeah, you're
It's
welcome.
in there after I printed.
It comes on late in the day, we don't look at our computers every minute.
Yeah, I looked at it first thing in the morning and printed. Sorry.
And I hate to read it all on my.
I got it right here.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so at the, let's see, at the December board, at one of the December board meetings, Bruce made a presentation about a possible use of the unassigned fund balance from the prior year. So the board approved the unassigned fund balance to move to the capital reserve fund. Bruce made a presentation about a proposed use of those funds, which is renovating the high school kitchen. This would be completing the loop of having the board make a motion to use funds in the capital reserve for the high school kitchen renovation.
Okay. Peter.
Just to get the discussion going, I'll move that we approve use it up to $2.65 million from the capital reserve fund to renovate the Middlebury Union High School kitchen.
Great, and I have a second?
I second.
Okay, Chip, great, thank you. Any questions or discussion? Questions for Logan?
Could we have Bruce just give a brief kind of overview of?
I didn't bring my slideshow. So, yeah, so we've experienced quite a few issues over the past, I'd say, decade in the high school kitchen. It's mostly original to the construction of the building, which was in the mid-50s, and we have plumbing issues, some electrical issues. The things that were updated in 1997 are now out of date. We're still operating some kitchen equipment that's 60 years old, so it's definitely a dire need.
But Bruce, one of the issues too is a lot of it's underground, correct?
Correct. Given the soils in the area, I guess, interact with the cast iron piping, and so it's probably not only the kitchen area that's a problem, but that we know that we've had sewer pipes below the kitchen slab that are no longer able to transport water, so they've collapsed. We've had to above the floor reroute drains into other spots that still work.
Jamie.
So is this money could handle that problem?
Yes, that's included in that.
That's included in like the estimate.
That's
The
why
estimate
it's
to-
so expensive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of money for basically less than 2,000 square feet of
Yeah, sure,
building.
okay.
That's why.
Okay, all right.
Barb.
Yeah. The only concern I have right now is that we had the presentation from Truex Collins to the facilities, and it's 61 mil, and we're trying to sort out what are we going to do, right? And when you look at the replacement cost ratio and all that kind of stuff, if we actually went into that scenario, we wouldn't want to spend money here if we decided as a, you know, as a board that, oh, we need to just do replacement. Not that that is likely gonna happen, but it could happen. And so until we've sorted out some of, you know, the information that we've been given, is it too soon to make this decision?
My understanding was that this was something, that the reason why we were doing this before the discussion of bond even came up was because this was sort of a must-do
Yeah.
at the top of the pile, but you can obviously speak to
Well,
that.
I mean, the risk we run is at some point, we will not be able to prepare meals in that space. And that day, I don't think is far off. So, yes, I certainly understand, and the full board hasn't had a presentation on the Truex Collins report, so, but basically, we're at a point where renovating the high school back up to code is gonna cost just a little bit less than building a new building. And so that's the struggle. Do we put money into the existing building, or do we build a new building? And it's a hard decision, and it's not one I can make, but definitely I feel like the problems that we're suffering in the kitchen now are dire enough that we need to address the problem.
So is there something incremental we could like do in 2 phases that would, you know, take part of this money? Or do we have to just do all of this money to solve, you know, the most critical part of the kitchen until, while we're sorting out the 61 mil, you know, the bigger issue?
Well, it's all really closely connected. So one of the biggest problems is the drains under the floor. Well, you cut up the floor, you've removed everything out of the kitchen. So that's where we're at with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think back to the other things we've done at the high school. So we did the bathrooms 3 or 4 years ago, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean, we have a lot of kind of incremental $1 and $2 million projects in the high school, and I guess given that, I mean, if I think of the likelihood of the community saying, yeah, let's build a new high school with all the other kinds of change we've been through, it doesn't, and again, we haven't got, I don't want to like put stuff out there and say like, put any kind of stamp out there right now, but I guess it seems like given all of the factors at play and the fact that the kitchen's in such bad shape that it makes sense to invest in it. We also did go out to the community in February and told them we're intending to use this money, this 2.3, for the kitchen. So we've also already started that process with the community too. Not that we couldn't come back and say, we've had second thoughts, or we're going to wait, or whatever. We could certainly do that. As costs are increasing too, that's another factor in terms of waiting on something like this, and how long it's going to take us to have clarity on that question about the high school could be quite a while too. I mean, I don't know, but it was something that I thought about too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mary Heather.
I would just reiterate, I think what I said when we first discussed this. I know at the high school, every time it rains, the roof leaks in the gym, and that has not risen to the list of priorities. And this has. I think we're looking at a project that will address a problem that immediately affects students. Like immediately. Could happen next year, could happen tomorrow. And I just don't think it's appropriate for us to ignore that. And I guess I'm sort of looking at it like, it's like you have that car where you're like hoping it'll pass inspection, and you take it to the garage and you're like, please do whatever we can do to make it pass inspection, because I don't want to buy the brand new car right now. I think that's the situation we're in with this kitchen. So that's the perspective I have, and just want to share that.
There's also just the benefit of, I don't know how many of you have eaten at the high school, but the food is really good. Since this is the first year that we've taken on all the military schools with our own food service, and it's quite good. So there's kind of more pride in it too, as opposed to when we were just contracting out.
Sure. But it impacts, breakfast, lunch, like students need this service. This is an immediate impact to students. So.
All right, so we've got a motion on the table. Should we? Did we?
Yes, Chip
Yep,
seconded.
Chip seconded it. Peter raised it. Are we ready to take a vote, or are there more questions or comments?
Sure.
All right, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any objections? Any abstentions?
Did you say flavor or favor?
Yeah, I thought she said flavor, but that's okay.
It's getting late.
Sorry about that. Great. It passed.
If we get to building a school, we can build it around the kitchen.
Really great.
If you decide to build a new school before we go out to bid.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just say the policy D1, this isn't for discussion tonight. It was just to get it on the agenda because we're gonna warn it for 2 weeks to vote on it. It sort of rose to the top because, as you saw, it talks about graduation requirements, and Caitlin felt that time was of the essence. So that, unless Mary has something she wants to add to that.
Unless Caitlin wants to talk about why we're reducing theory of knowledge to 0.5 versus 1.
But Nargis should have stayed.
What's that?
So Nargis should have stayed.
Well, no, for what to impact a diploma candidate, right? So if Nargis is pursuing the full diploma, this change would not impact her.
Okay.
The concept is that theory of knowledge is a full year course. It's offered in the spring and then fall semester, spring of junior year, fall of senior year, so that students take it concurrently with all of their 6 subject areas in the diploma program. Several years ago, we wrote it in as an MUHS graduation requirement because it's such a cool class. It's a class about understanding how do we know what we know about the world? What are the ways of knowing and the areas of knowledge so that we can understand a lot of different topics from a lot of different perspectives in our world. Very cool class. It's proven to be a bit of a burden on as a graduation requirement, in that it asks more of our students, and as we were talking about, sometimes you need to make choices in an 8-period day. This is one thing that makes it hard for students necessarily to choose all the things they want. So I actually think Justin can do this better than I can. The high school teachers advocated for reducing that to a half credit for those students who are not pursuing the IB diploma. So they still get the big ideas of the course, but it's less of a time commitment for those students. So the only recommended change in this policy is that we reduce theory of knowledge to a half credit, and that brings our graduation credits down from, was it 23 to 22.5 if you're looking at that highlighted in yellow.
Yeah.
All of the places where that one change would ripple through that policy. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you covered it well.
Great.
All right, with that being said, I'm going to skip other, and we're going to, can I have a motion to adjourn into executive session?
Personnel?
Into executive session, discuss personnel.
I have a question.
Yes.
Being a little bit new here, on what basis, aside from time, do we skip other?
Time. I just thought,
Okay.
do you have another that you wanted to raise?
I do.
Oh, all right, go ahead.
How bad is it? I don't know. So I'll try to be very quick. Is that okay?
Yep.
One is that I would just like to voice my, support, I guess, for the folks who spoke tonight about public comment. I'm concerned about that issue, and I think the change that we've made to sort of curtail or sort of silo those things should be a debate we should have as a group. The second one, I'll be very brief again, is that I think we have a small problem And that problem stems from a discussion we had on our policy committee, which was, whenever that was, a couple days ago. So our policy committee determined, after meeting with Pietro Lynn, that our A6 policy, he clarified what it means for us, for our board. And we specifically spoke at length, actually, about Joanna. Because there's all this stuff coming up that Joanna may have a conflict of interest, being that she's on Ripton School Board, et cetera. Everyone knows this. So he confirmed that she does not. But the public thinks that she does. And so I think that we should clarify that. Because right now, she's like people ask me this all the time. So I'm curious how we could do that.
I think at next board meeting, we were gonna have committee updates, and we can cover that topic in committee updates.
Because those
It would be
policies
reported
will
out
be
by
coming
the policy
forward.
committee.
Yeah, it's
It
just,
would be an update as to what occurred at the last policy meeting and what we learned.
okay. I guess it seems to me like there's a long-standing, at least from my perspective, question about this sort of like ability to participate on the board as a full member. And that matter has more or less been settled. And I think correcting the record, like publicly, is important. And I think doing it sooner than later is important. And so I don't know how we should do that.
So I think that we can do that at next meeting during
Okay.
committee updates.
If that's the best way to do it, then we'll do it. I'm sorry for raising
And
it.
then I'll make sure it gets
I'll just say,
notified.
well, I'll just say, it's clarified in the minutes of the meeting. I mean, it doesn't
Right,
get
and
into
it's
specifics
also
of people
in
and
the public
whatnot, but it
meeting.
does get into the discussion about what constitutes a conflict of interest.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, a lot of people don't read the public minutes of the meeting, but I understand, yeah. No, that's fine. We can talk about next meeting. I just wanted to raise it. Thank
And
you.
we can get the public comment. I thought we covered it in the retreat.
Yeah.
But just as an FYI, nothing has changed on public comment. It's just that we've printed it on the agenda. It's always been 3 minutes. You know, it's always been, we don't hear things about specific teachers or specific students. And
Yeah.
now we printed on the agenda to make that clear, because we have had in the past instances where someone comes and it becomes a sort of uncomfortable situation where they're talking about specific students and things that happen, and you feel like they don't maybe know that they're committing this to a public record.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of trying to protect those
Yeah.
people from having their story or a grievance where they're not able to respond or whatever it is on the public record.
Right. I think that's good, personally. I mean, I don't think we should out people. I think the 3-minute rule seemed like, we started saying it a few weeks ago, and it seemed that people, I mean, I perceived it as a change, especially since it was a reaction
Yeah,
to.
it used to be said if there was a whole crew of people sitting in the here, then
Yeah.
the chair would state it.
Yeah,
Since it's printed on the agenda, I've just started saying it. If that makes people uncomfortable, we can not say it, we just leave it printed, but but I think we can take this up in August.
We need to have more discussion on this.
Yeah.
I know it's controversial, this is not the time to do it.
Yep.
Okay, I didn't know-
Some of us that don't feel the same as you, Jen, so I mean, I think we need to be very clear on the board as to what our role should be.
I agree, that's why I brought it up.
Yeah. And at one point, the board had established norms,
Right.
and I think that maybe it might be good, they're in the minutes somewhere, I can go find them, but I can drag them back out, because we did establish them once for what the board norms were as far as interacting and working
Okay,
together.
okay.
So we can pull them back up, find out if they still work for us. If they
Okay.
don't,
Yeah,
we can change them.
I'm happy to do that.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you. And I'm sorry, I skipped other because I assumed nobody had.
That's fine, that's fine. No. When you assume.
I know, exactly. Kicked in the head. Okay,
You can
so.
finish it, go.
No, it's public.
I'll make
a motion to-
move into executive session for the purpose of personnel,
Thank you very much.
or VSA, whatever it is, I can't remember.
Okay,
And I'll second it, I think we need a second, right?
thank you, and all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so we'll just take a couple minutes to get